Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another scary story. Your place where we uncover the darkest mysteries in a calming and reflective way. For the next hour, I want you to put on your earphones, put your phone face down, and close your eyes. Relax, and let this story take you to a world full of chills and mystery. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, leave a comment sharing where in the world you're listening from. Now get comfortable and relax. I was 14 the night it happened, but I can still feel it like a hand pressed against my chest. That kind of fear doesn't fade. It sinks into you, reshapes you. My name's Ethan Carter, and I grew up in a place called Black Hollow, Vermont. Population just under 200. The kind of town where folks don't ask too many questions and the trees seem like they've been watching you for centuries. Our house sat at the edge of the Green Mountains, an old creaking farmhouse that had been in our family for generations. Every nail and board in that place held a story, some darker than others. My parents were superstitious people, maybe a little too much for comfort. They weren't religious exactly, but they believed. In what, though, was always vague. Things in the woods, curses, the kind of whispers people share at the edge of firelight when they think kids aren't listening. I listened. Growing up, I shared a room with my two older brothers, Jake and Marcus. My little sister Lila had her own room across the hall. Our parents ran the family hardware store in town, and when they came home, the talk at dinner was always about small-town politics or bizarre things customers had said. But sometimes, when the wind picked up and the dogs refused to go outside, my dad would lean back in his chair, rub his stubbled jaw, and say things like, "This ain't the kind of place you want to be wandering around after midnight." We'd all heard the stories. Shadow people, skinwalkers, things that wore the shapes of people you knew. My grandma used to tell me never to whistle in the woods, never to call anyone's name after dark, and never to open the door if I heard knocking past midnight. "If it's real," she said, "it'll wait for morning." The older I got, the more I wrote it all off as folklore, country talk meant to keep dumb kids from sneaking off into the trees. And it worked mostly. I never went far, not alone. But that year, 2015, was different. Something shifted in the air as summer turned to fall. The nights came faster, heavier. The animals around the woods got quiet. And on October 17th, I would learn what my family had been afraid of all along. Not ghosts, not whispers, not stories. Something real. Something that came for us. It was a Saturday night, and I was the only one still awake. Jake and Marcus had crashed hours ago, probably after sneaking out to meet friends and sneaking back in through the side window like they always did. My parents had turned in early, Dad snoring like a freight train through the thin walls, and Lila was passed out with a nightlight humming in her room, surrounded by her usual mess of stuffed animals and books. I was curled up on the living room couch with a thick blanket, a bowl of cold popcorn, and a half-drunk root beer sweating on the coffee table. The house was quiet, save for the sound of an old horror show playing on the TV, something grainy and slow with bad acting and too much dramatic music. The clock on the VCR said 2:54 a.m. when the screen started flickering, not in a glitchy, bad signal kind of way. This was something else. The screen cut to static, screeched once so loud I had to cover my ears, and then went black. Just like that. No hum, no power down sound. The TV was dead. At first I thought maybe the power went out, but the hallway light was still on. The air conditioner in the window buzzed like normal. I sat there for a second, staring at the blank screen, thinking maybe I'd blown a fuse or something. But then I noticed something strange. The curtains. A glow pulsed through them, soft at first, then brighter. Not white, not yellow like headlights, or a flashlight. This was red and blue, but not like police lights either. More alive. The colors didn't alternate. They throbbed, like a heartbeat. My own heart started thudding in my ears like it was trying to match the rhythm. No one came out this far, not this late. The road ended a quarter mile from our driveway, and beyond that was nothing but woods for miles. I stood slowly, setting the popcorn aside, and crossed the room to the window. I didn't open the curtain all the way, just enough to peek through the slit. What I saw didn't make sense. There was no car, no people, just light. Thick beams of it sweeping over the trees, rising up from behind the barn like someone had parked a glowing engine in the yard. Then I felt it, that pressure, that invisible weight that hits you when you know someone is watching. The kind of awareness you get when your gut knows something your eyes haven't caught up to yet. I turned away from the window, slow as molasses, afraid to make noise. That's when I saw them. Two of them standing just feet away near the edge of the couch. They weren't tall exactly, maybe my height, but they looked stretched, like someone had taken a human shape and pulled it too thin. Their skin was this sick, almost bruised purple-gray color. No hair, no clothes I could see. Just these long arms hanging too low, and those heads bulbous, almost teardrop-shaped, with eyes like wet glass, big, black and still. One of them tilted its head at me like a dog trying to understand what it was looking at. It didn't blink. It didn't move. But somehow I felt like it was inside my head, sorting through my thoughts like someone flipping through an old photo album. I didn't scream. I couldn't. My lungs locked up, and my mouth barely opened. I backed up, hit the couch behind me, and dropped straight down. I yanked the blanket over my head like I was 5 years old again. My heart was hammering, my breath shallow and fast. That's when everything got quiet. Too quiet. Like the air had been sucked out of the room. I remember the way my body suddenly felt heavy. Not tired, not sleepy. More like someone pressing down on me with an invisible hand. I fought to keep my eyes open, but it was like my body had been hit with a sedative. I passed out. Just like that. No dreams, no thoughts. Just a black nothing until the sun came up. When I woke up, everything felt off. That's the only way I can explain it. The sunlight was streaming through the windows, the birds were chirping like they always did, and the TV was back to showing its usual black screen with the blinking blue standby light. But none of it felt right. The light was too bright, like it had something to prove. The air was thick, heavier than it should have been, like the house itself was holding its breath. My blanket had slipped halfway off the couch and my legs were cold. I sat up slowly, trying to piece together what happened the night before. For a few seconds it was just hazy fear, like the kind you get after a nightmare. But then the details came crashing back. The lights, the figures, the feeling of being watched. And then I remembered. I'd blacked out. I rubbed my face with both hands, trying to shake it off. Maybe I'd fallen asleep and dreamed the whole thing. It was possible. I'd watched enough horror to scramble my brain. But it hadn't felt like a dream. It felt too real. I pushed myself up and went straight to the window. Outside, everything looked normal. The grass was damp with dew. The barn stood where it always had, its weathered red paint fading more with each season. No sign of lights, no burn marks on the ground, no footprints in the dirt. Just silence. Still, something was off. At breakfast, Jake was already at the table, digging into a bowl of cereal. Marcus stumbled in a few minutes later, half asleep and scratching his chest. I waited to see if either of them would say anything. Nothing at first. Then Jake spoke, not looking up from his bowl. "Did you hear anything weird last night?" My heart skipped. "Like what?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. "I don't know. Footsteps or something. I thought I saw someone in the hallway, but when I turned the light on, there was nothing there." Marcus scoffed. "Probably just a dream, man. You were stoned, weren't you?" Jake didn't answer. That was enough of an answer. Then Lila came down the stairs, dragging her blanket behind her. She looked tired, pale. Her big eyes scanned the room before she climbed up into the chair beside me. "I saw something last night," she said quietly. "It was tall, standing outside my door. I thought it was Daddy, but it didn't move right. I closed my eyes and it went away. I looked over at my parents. Mom had stopped stirring her coffee. Dad was staring out the window, pretending not to listen, but I saw his jaw clench. They knew something. My mom tried to brush it off, laughing in that way she does when she's nervous. Probably just your imagination, baby. You've been watching too many spooky cartoons. But her eyes told a different story. She wasn't just brushing it off for Lila's sake. She was scared too. We all fell into this weird silence after that. Nobody wanted to keep talking about it, but nobody could stop thinking about it either. I kept waiting for someone to bring it up again. Jake didn't. Marcus rolled his eyes and changed the subject. And me? I spent the rest of that day walking through the house, opening closet doors, checking under beds, staring out the windows like a paranoid maniac. Everything looked normal, but nothing felt that way. That night I didn't turn the TV on, didn't touch the couch. I locked my door, shoved a dresser in front of it, and slept with the lights on. And even then I swear I heard footsteps in the hallway, not heavy ones. Light, careful, like someone or something was checking to see if we were still asleep. I started noticing little changes after that night. Not big, not loud. Just subtle things. Barely there. Like a whisper you're not sure you really heard. The first was the dog. Our old mutt Rusty never liked staying inside for long. He was a free roamer, the kind of dog who'd spend all day out in the woods and come home muddy and proud of himself. But the day after that night, he refused to leave the porch. I called him, tried to coax him down the steps, even tossed his favorite stick into the yard. He didn't move. Just sat there, ears back, eyes fixed on the tree line like he was waiting for something to come out. That was the first time I started to believe what I saw wasn't a dream. A few nights later, I was up late again. Couldn't sleep. I was jumpy all the time, flinching at floor creaks and wind against the windows. I'd stopped watching horror shows completely, which said a lot, since they used to be my thing. I had a notebook on my desk now, half filled with notes. Times, dates, stuff I remembered, stuff my siblings said. I didn't even know why I was writing it all down. Maybe it helped me feel like I had some control. Around 1:30 a.m., I heard the back door click. Not slam, not creak, just a soft click like someone easing it open. I froze. My room was upstairs, but it sat above the kitchen. The sound was unmistakable. Rusty started barking. Not the usual bark either. This was that low, deep bark he only used when he saw another animal, or a stranger. I got up and crept to my window, lifting the corner of the curtain. The porch light was off, but the moon gave me enough to see the yard. There was movement near the edge of the barn, something quick, low to the ground. Then it was gone. The next morning I found small prints in the mud by the garden. Not paw prints, not bare feet either. They were narrow, long, almost like bird feet, but with 4 toes. Deep impressions like whatever it was had weight. I showed them to Dad. He barely looked at them before saying, "Probably raccoons. You know how they are. But raccoons don't leave prints like that, and they don't trigger the porch sensor, light to flicker like it's got a short." Later that day, I overheard my parents talking in the kitchen. Their voices were low, tense. I was standing on the basement stairs out of sight. "We need to tell them," Mom said. "They've seen things. It's not like we can hide it anymore." Dad's reply was sharp. "No. You start talking about it, you give it power. That's how it works." That stuck with me. You give it power. It wasn't just superstition. It was something they believed deep down. Something they knew. And then there was Lila. She stopped sleeping in her room. Said the shadows under. Her bed moved when she blinked. She dragged her blanket and pillow into my room every night after that. We didn't talk about it. I just let her sleep on the floor beside my bed. One night, she sat up around 2 a.m. and whispered, "They don't like light." I asked who. She didn't answer. Just curled back up and pulled the blanket over her head. I started keeping a flashlight beside my pillow because I was starting to believe her. It was exactly 1 week later, October 24th, when everything came to a head. The weather had turned colder fast, and a strange fog had started to hang low in the mornings. clinging to the ground like it didn't want to let go. Even the leaves, already dead and fallen, looked like they didn't want to move. Everything just felt still. That night I couldn't sleep again. None of us could. Jake was pacing the hallway like he was waiting for something. Marcus kept opening and closing the blinds like a nervous tick. Even my parents were acting strange. My mom didn't cook dinner, which she always did, even when she was dead tired. My dad sat in the living room with the shotgun across his lap, eyes locked on the front door. Nobody said it out loud, but we all knew something was going to happen. At around 2:15 a.m., the power went out. No storm, no warning. Just a loud click and then darkness. Total and complete. Even the night seemed to hold its breath. I grabbed the flashlight from beside my bed and clicked it on. Lila was already awake, sitting cross-legged on the floor in her sleeping bag. She was staring at the wall. I asked if she was okay. "They're here," she said. "They're already inside." Before I could answer, we heard it, a hum. It started low, like it was coming from under the floorboards. A deep vibration in the air so low it made my chest ache. Then it grew louder, rising through the walls like the house itself was vibrating. Rusty was barking again, louder than ever, but it sounded like it was coming from far away. I realized then he was outside. Why the hell was he outside? I opened my door slowly and stepped into the hall. Jake and Marcus were both there, standing completely still, their backs against the wall like they were trying not to breathe. My flashlight beam danced over their faces. They looked like statues. Then something moved. At the far end of the hallway, near the attic door, a shape flickered, like a shadow stepping out of another shadow. It wasn't walking. It sort of slid, smooth and slow. The flashlight flickered when I pointed it at it, like the batteries were dying. I turned and ran back to my room, slammed the door shut, locked it, shoved a chair under the handle. "Don't look at them," Lila whispered. "They don't like that." Then the humming stopped. And that's when the lights came. Not the house lights. Outside. Blinding white, cutting through the curtains, lighting up the room like noon in July. It wasn't a beam. It was everything. All of it. As if the world outside had turned to light, then silence. No humming, no footsteps, no barking. Not even the creak of the old house. Just a long, thick pause. And then I blacked out again. When I came to, it was morning. The light in the room was normal. My flashlight was on the floor, still on. My mom was standing in the hallway, eyes red, like she'd been crying. Dad was in the kitchen, holding his coffee cup like he couldn't remember how to drink from it. No one said anything. Not about the power outage, not about the light. Not about the fact that Jake had scratches on his arms or that Marcus wouldn't stop staring at the fireplace like he was waiting for something to crawl out of it. I wanted to scream at them, to ask what the hell happened. But I didn't. I knew I wouldn't get an answer. A few months later we moved. No explanation. Just packed up and left Black Hollow behind like it was a bad dream we didn't want to talk about anymore. I never went back. Neither did any of my siblings. Now at 22, I live in a small apartment in Burlington. I keep the blinds closed at night. I don't watch horror movies anymore. I don't talk about that week in October. But sometimes when I'm walking home late or lying awake in bed, I feel it. That presence. The same one from the living room, from the hallway, from outside my window. Sometimes I'll catch a flicker in the corner of my eye. A shadow that shouldn't be there. A hum that fades before I can tell if it was real. I never see them fully, just enough to know they're still out there, still watching, still waiting. It was a dying town, Blackwater, Massachusetts. The mills had all shut down years ago, leaving the streets lined with abandoned buildings, faded signs, and rusting machinery. People moved out as fast as they moved in, and the ones who stayed had no choice. The town's soul had been siphoned away, leaving only a hollow shell. Blackwater was a place you passed through, on your way to somewhere else. No one ever came here to stay, but there was one place in town that still had some life left in it, St. Ignatius Parish. The old stone church at the heart of town had stood for over 100 years, its towering spire cutting through the gray skies like a silent sentinel. For the longest time, it had been a place of refuge for the community, a small beacon of hope in the otherwise bleak landscape. But as the years wore on, it too began to show signs of wear. The stone was crumbling, the windows chipped, the air inside musty and cold. The church's bells had stopped ringing years ago, and no one really knew why. Father Byrne, the priest, was a quiet man who seemed more a relic of the past than a presence in the present. He always had a distant look in his eyes, like he was remembering things no one else could understand. I was 15 when I started volunteering there. My best friend Derek Cole and I were both part of the youth group that helped maintain the church. It was mostly busy work, dusting pews, folding hymnals, and occasionally organizing fundraisers for the church's upkeep. But I loved the feeling of being part of something, even if that something was slowly crumbling around us. Derek and I had grown up in Blackwater, and the church was as much a part of our childhood as the overgrown schoolyard or the rundown diner on Main Street. But there were strange things about that church, things no one ever talked about. I remember the first time I saw the basement. It was a few months after I started volunteering. Father Byrne had asked me to help him retrieve some old records from the storage room downstairs, a place I'd always heard about but never seen. The stairs down to the basement creaked under my feet as I descended, the air growing colder with each step. The basement smelled like old books, like dust and mildew, but there was something else there, something heavier. I couldn't place it at the time, but it felt oppressive, like the walls were closing in on me. There were boxes piled high in the corners, old church furniture, and a few crates that had been stacked haphazardly. But the thing that stood out to me the most was the far corner, the corner where the light didn't seem to reach. It felt wrong, like there was something hidden there that shouldn't be found. "Father, what's behind that door?" I had asked, pointing toward a small rusted door at the back of the basement. Father Byrne's eyes flickered with something, a flash of fear maybe. I couldn't tell. He immediately waved me off. "That's where we keep some older records," he said quickly, but his voice was tight. "Nothing to worry about. Let's just focus on what we came for." I didn't think much of it then, but that moment stayed with me. There was something about the way he reacted that made me uneasy. And then there was the story about the previous caretaker. I'd heard bits and pieces of it over the years, mostly whispered rumors. The caretaker had been a man named Henry Klein. He had worked at St. Ignatius for decades, taking care of the church and its grounds. He was known to be a quiet, solitary man, much like Father Byrne. But one night, for reasons no one could ever explain, Henry climbed up to the bell tower and hanged himself. There were no signs of foul play, no note left behind. Just the strange fact that a man who had been trusted with the church's upkeep had taken his own life in such a brutal way. The town never spoke of it openly, but it was known. People said the church had a darkness to it, something that hung over it like a curse. It was as if the walls themselves were holding on to the pain of all the souls who had passed through them. And Father Byrne, he never spoke of Henry, not once. The topic seemed to make him uncomfortable, even angry. I remember once trying to ask him about the old caretaker, but he cut me off so sharply I thought I might have crossed a line I didn't know existed. "You have to be careful with things like that, Lucas," he said, his voice low and stern. "Some things are better left undisturbed." That warning never left me. Looking back, I should have known that things at St. Ignatius weren't right. But when you're young, you don't always trust your instincts. You don't realize how much weight history carries, or how the past lingers in places long after the people are gone, and I certainly didn't understand what was waiting for us that November night, but I would soon. November 5th, 2016, 11:23 p.m. The night had started innocently enough, but by the time the clock struck 11:23 p.m., everything began to change. We were a small group of us, just Derek, Mia, Ryan, and me, volunteering at St. Ignatius for a fundraiser. The plan was simple. We'd stay overnight, stack hymnals, and get a few things organized for the upcoming charity event. We were all in our late teens, so the idea of spending the night in an old church doing busy work wasn't as horrifying as it might sound. We joked around mostly, making fun of the church's creaking floors and ancient decor. I think we were trying to make it feel normal, trying to ignore the fact that St. Ignatius had always felt different. The church had been here longer than any of us, and it carried with it a weight that none of us could quite explain. It was Mia who first noticed the light. We had just finished stacking the last of the hymnals in the sacristy, and Derek was fiddling, with his phone in the back corner of the room, while Ryan tried to put together some half-hearted prayer candles for the fundraiser display. Mia was near the stained glass window, looking out into the cemetery behind the church, the one that had been there longer than the building itself. "Hey, Lucas," she called softly. "What's that?" I looked up from what I was doing, confused. Her voice didn't sound normal, like she wasn't just asking a casual question. There was a hint of anxiety, maybe even fear in it. I walked over to the window and followed her gaze, squinting through the colored glass, past the arching cemetery gates, past the rows of weathered gravestones. And there it was, a pulsing white light. At first I thought it was a plane, but it was too slow. It wasn't moving like any aircraft I'd ever seen. The light hovered in midair, almost perfectly still. It wasn't flashing, like a plane's lights, and it wasn't twinkling, like a star. It was just this cold, unnatural glow that hovered above the cemetery like it was waiting for something. "Is that a satellite?" Ryan asked, standing behind me and peering over my shoulder. But even as he said it, I could see the doubt in his eyes. It wasn't moving like a satellite either. Satellites don't hover. We all stood there watching, frozen. Then the light began to move, but not in the way you'd expect. It didn't simply drift across the sky or fall toward the ground, like a shooting star. It streaked downward almost at an angle toward the cemetery, and when it did, I felt a chill crawl up my spine. The temperature in the room dropped suddenly, like someone had opened a window in the middle of winter. I could almost feel the weight of the air, thick and heavy, pressing down on me. The light didn't make a sound as it descended, but then, that's when it came. A scream. It wasn't human. It sounded like an animal, something caught in a trap, something being skinned alive. It tore through the night air with a raw, horrific noise. The kind of scream that hits you in your gut. Something primal that makes you want to run, makes your body scream that something is very wrong. I turned toward Derek instinctively. His face was pale, his eyes wide, his hand gripping my arm. "That wasn't fucking normal," he whispered, his voice low and shaken. His words cut through the air like a warning. Before anyone could say anything else, there was another sound. A mechanical whine, like a dying amplifier, but far worse. It sounded like the very air around us was being ripped apart. And then, just as quickly as it had come, the sound stopped. The air cleared, but that smell, that stench lingered. It smelled like burnt hair. Ryan gagged, covering his mouth and nose with his sleeve. "What the hell was that?" he said, his voice trembling. I couldn't speak. I just stood there staring out the window at the cemetery, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what we had just witnessed, but I felt the undeniable truth that something was very wrong. Mia was the first to speak again. She backed away from the window, her face white, eyes wide with terror. "We need to lock the doors, all of them, now." Derek nodded, his voice hoarse. "Yeah, that's a good idea." We scrambled to lock every door in the church. We had to make sure every window was sealed shut, even though it felt like that pulsing light was still out there watching us. I didn't know what to do next. There was no way to explain what we'd just seen, no way to make sense of it. A light in the sky, a strange, unearthly scream. But as we huddled together in the sacristy, I realized that the night was far from over. Whatever was happening here was just getting started. And the worst part, I could still smell that burnt hair lingering in the back of my mind as if it had somehow attached itself to my thoughts. I knew then that we were not alone in the church. And whatever was out there, waiting for us, wasn't just in the sky. It was already inside. After locking all the doors, we huddled in the sacristy, trying to make sense of the inexplicable. The pulsing light and the terrible screech had left us all on edge, but we weren't about to just run out into the night. We didn't know what we were dealing with, and none of us wanted to risk stepping back into that cemetery, not with whatever had just happened hanging in the air. So we stayed inside, our nerves on edge, unsure of what to do next. I sat down on the pew closest to the altar, trying to catch my breath. My hands were shaking. The sound of the burnt hair, the strange mechanical whine, kept echoing in my ears. It was as if the noise had carved its way into my mind and I couldn't shake it off. I wasn't the only one who felt the weight of the night pressing down on us. Derek was pacing, his brow furrowed in that way he always did when he was trying to make sense of something. Mia and Ryan sat closer together on the floor, whispering in hushed tones, clearly just as terrified but too afraid to leave the safety of the sacristy. We were all too quiet. No one was talking, no one knew what to say. It was as if we were waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the next sign that whatever had been triggered that night was about to make itself known. But what could we do? We couldn't just stay here, but we couldn't leave either. The night was thick with tension, as if the very air around us was charged with electricity, and none of us could bring ourselves to break the silence. Then, from outside the sacristy, I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. At first, I thought it was someone from the church. Maybe Father Byrne had returned, or perhaps the others from the youth group had come to check on us. But when I listened closely, I realized something wasn't right. The footsteps were too heavy, too deliberate, like someone was pacing back and forth. Step, drag, step, drag. I glanced at Derek. He had heard it too, his expression instantly hardening. Mia and Ryan looked up, eyes wide with confusion, and I could see that they were both holding their breath, waiting for the footsteps to stop. I could feel my own pulse quicken. The noise was coming from the hallway outside the sacristy, from the direction of the stairs that led down to the basement. There was no one else in the church. We had made sure of that. So who the hell was pacing the halls? Mia's voice barely whispered through the silence, her voice trembling. There's no one else here. I swallowed hard. The footsteps continued, dragging across the old wooden floorboards, the rhythm slow and deliberate, as if someone were methodically walking around the church, testing the space. I moved toward the door, pressing my ear against the old, creaky wood. The footsteps mirrored my breathing. Every time I inhaled, the steps echoed. When I exhaled, they seemed to draw nearer. My breath hitched in my throat, my chest tight with a combination of fear and confusion. And then I realized, whenever I held my breath, the footsteps stopped. I didn't understand it at first, but there it was. The footsteps followed my movements, almost like they were mimicking me. I released my breath slowly and the dragging steps started again, louder this time, as if whatever was out there was trying to get closer. That's when I heard the knock. 3 slow, deliberate raps against the door. Knock, knock, knock. It was too perfect, too measured, and that's when the fear fully gripped me. My heart slammed against my ribs, my legs shaking beneath me as I stood frozen at the door. The knocking came from outside, but no one was there. No one had entered the church. Ryan, unable to contain himself any longer, let out a strangled scream, his voice cutting through the tension. What the fuck is that? I turned quickly to look at him, and I could see his face was as pale as mine. His eyes were wide with panic, his breathing erratic. Didn't know what to do. The door to the sacristy was locked, but I felt like it wouldn't matter if whatever was outside wanted in. There was no way we could escape this. Derek's voice broke through the silence. We need to check it out, he said, his voice low and filled with an edge I hadn't heard from him before. He was trying to sound brave, but I could tell he was scared too. We can't just stay here. But I didn't want to move. Every inch of me screamed to stay put, to hide, to just hope whatever was out there would leave us alone. But Derek was already standing up, his hand on the door, ready to open it. No, Mia whispered, her voice trembling. Please don't. I can't do this. I knew she was right. None of us were ready to face whatever was on the other side of that door, but there was no choice. We had to confront it. Derek turned the handle slowly, as if giving the door a chance to decide whether it wanted to open. The silence in the sacristy was deafening, and then, with a sudden jolt, the door swung open on its own. There was no one there. I don't know what I expected to see, but it certainly wasn't nothing. The hallway outside the sacristy was empty, the dim lighting casting long shadows against the cracked walls. There was no sign of movement, no figure standing at the end of the hall, but the air felt wrong. It felt heavier somehow, as if the space around us was filled with something that didn't belong, something that had been there long before we had. Stepped cautiously into the hallway, my pulse racing. The air tasted sour and my heart pounded in my chest. I had no idea what we were walking into, but something told me that what we had just heard, those footsteps, was only the beginning. We crept forward in the darkness, moving slowly, each of us too afraid to speak. The footsteps were gone, but the oppressive silence weighed down on us. I could feel something watching us just out of sight, something lurking in the shadows. I wanted to turn and run, but my legs wouldn't move. We reached the end of the hallway, and just as I thought we were safe, just as I thought we'd made it through the worst of it, we heard it again. The footsteps. Step. Drag. Step. Drag. They were back. The footsteps had returned. That heavy, dragging sound, step, drag, pierced the oppressive silence of the church, each footfall seeming to echo through the bones of the old building. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get out of the church and never look back. But there was nowhere to go. The doors were locked, and whatever was out there was clearly determined to make itself known. We were standing in the hallway, just past the sacristy, and the air had grown thick with something wrong. The kind of wrong that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. The kind of wrong that chills you to your very core. Derek was still ahead, leading the group, his hand gripping the edge of a candle holder for support as he cautiously stepped forward. His face was pale, his brow furrowed in concentration, but I could see the fear behind his eyes. Mia was behind me, and I could feel her shaking, the quiver in her breath, as she tried to stay composed. Ryan was the last, trailing behind us, but I could hear the panic in his every movement, shuffling as if he was trying to make himself smaller, less noticeable. "Just stay close," Derek said, his voice a strained whisper, barely audible in the stillness. "We need to check the main hall. There might be someone else here, someone messing with us." But even as he said that, I knew the truth. This wasn't someone. This was something else entirely. The footsteps grew louder. Step, drag, step, drag. It was coming closer, moving down the hallway toward us. No one said anything, but I could feel the tension building in the air. We didn't need to speak. We all knew the feeling, the dread, the coldness that had settled into our bones. Then, without warning, the knocking began again. 3 deliberate raps, one after another. Knock, knock, knock. It wasn't at the door to the sacristy this time. It came from deeper in the church, from the direction of the bell tower. It felt like a challenge, like whatever was out there was, daring us to follow it. Derek, his face a mask of determination and fear, moved forward again. "Come on," he said, his voice low. "We're going to the bell tower." The bell tower. The very place where the caretaker, Henry Klein, had hanged himself. The place no one ever spoke about, where the air had always felt thick, oppressive. I didn't want to go. I didn't want any part of this night anymore. But my feet moved anyway, as if they were being dragged by some unseen force. Mia followed, her breathing shallow, almost inaudible, and Ryan kept his distance, the fear in his eyes now turning to something deeper, something darker. We reached the base of the tower stairs, and Derek hesitated for a moment, looking back at the others. His expression was hard to read, but I could see that something in him had changed. The cocky confidence that had been there earlier had evaporated, replaced by a grim resolve. He was scared too. "We need to do something," Derek said quietly, almost to himself. He turned to face me and Mia. "We need to go up. We need to face whatever's in there." I felt my stomach drop. "What do you mean, face it?" I whispered, my voice shaky. "Derek, we don't even know what it is." "I know," he replied, his voice steady but his eyes betraying him. "But we can't just stay down here. Whatever's messing with us, it's not going to stop until we do something." I didn't know if I could do it. I wanted to turn around, to run down the hallway and out of that church, but a part of me knew it wouldn't make a difference. Whatever it wasn't going to let us leave. Not yet. We started to climb the stairs, each step creaking under our weight. The further we went up, the colder it got. The air was thinner, colder, and more suffocating with every foot we climbed. My legs felt heavier. My breath came in short gasps, and my heart pounded in my chest as though it was trying to escape. I was so focused on the steps in front of me I couldn't even hear the others anymore. I could only hear the thudding of my own heart, the pulse of dread that seemed to be sinking with every step I took. And then, we reached the top. The bell tower was just as I remembered it. Dark, cramped, and cold. The window at the far end was cracked open, allowing a little moonlight to spill in, but it didn't feel like it was enough to push back the darkness. The whole room felt like it was holding its breath. Derek was the first to move. He walked over to the center of the room, his gaze fixed on something in the shadows. I followed him, but with each step the air grew heavier, denser, and I could feel a presence like a weight pressing down on me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone here, that something was watching us, waiting. That's when I saw it. It was a handprint. A black, smudged handprint, but it wasn't on the floor or the walls. It was on Father Burns' collar, on the one piece of clothing he had worn that night when he arrived at the church. I don't know why it took me so long to notice. The priest had been reciting Psalm 23 when we'd knelt, trying to calm us down. He had placed his hands on our heads, praying with a fervor I hadn't seen from him before. His hands had shaken slightly, but it wasn't until later, after everything had gone quiet, that I realized the mark on his collar wasn't just a stain. It was a handprint. But not a normal handprint. The fingers were too long, the mark too dark. I stared at it in disbelief. It didn't make sense, this couldn't be real, and yet it was. Father Byrne had been acting strange when he had arrived. He had dismissed us with his usual stern demeanor, but his eyes, they were different, empty, like he was already seeing, something that we couldn't. It made my stomach twist in a way I couldn't explain. When he recited the psalm, his voice had cracked when he reached the valley of the shadow of death. I was staring at the mark, unable to tear my eyes away. When I heard it, Father Byrne's voice faltering slightly as he finished the prayer, and then a low, guttural whisper, almost inaudible, as if it came from deep within the walls of the church itself. "You shouldn't have come." The voice wasn't Father Byrne's. We all heard it, and we all knew. We weren't just dealing with the supernatural. We were dealing with something much older, much darker, and far more dangerous than we could ever have imagined. The church was alive with something that wanted us to stay. Forever. The door to the bell tower slammed shut behind us, and the knocking started again. Knock. 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 This time it was louder, closer, more insistent, and I knew, without a doubt, we weren't going to make it out of here. The bell tower door slammed shut with a force that shook the entire building. It was the kind of slam that rattled your bones and made your stomach drop in panic. The knocking started immediately. Afterward, louder this time, 3 deafening raps that sounded like they came from every direction. The sound reverberated off the old stone walls, filling the tower with an overwhelming sense of dread. It felt like the church was alive, and it was angry. My heart was pounding in my chest, too loud to hear anything else. I wanted to scream, to break free from this nightmare, but my body refused to move. It was like the weight of the air had thickened, and every breath I took was a struggle. Mia was standing beside me, her face pale and frozen in terror, while Ryan's eyes darted around the tower looking for an escape that wasn't there. Derek Derek, who had been the one to push us this far, was standing near the center of the room, his face white as a sheet, his body rigid with fear. He was staring at something I couldn't see, something beyond our comprehension. "We have to get out of here," Mia finally whispered, her voice a broken tremor in the silence that followed the knocking. "Please, Lucas, let's just leave. This isn't real. It's not real." But I knew it was real. Everything about this night had been real. The footsteps, the voices, the strange light. None of it could be explained. And now we were trapped in a church that felt like it was breathing with us. A church that held a darkness so deep it threatened to consume us. "Derek?" I croaked, my voice barely audible. "What's happening? What is it?" He didn't answer at first. He just kept staring into the shadows at the far end of the tower, his face blank with fear, like he was seeing something we couldn't. Then, as if in a trance, he turned slowly toward us, his eyes wide with a mix of terror and something darker, something that made my blood run cold. "We have to go," Derek repeated, his voice low and strained. "Now, before it's too late." But it was already too late. A low growl sounded from the shadows, deep, guttural, and so inhuman that it made my stomach turn. The growl reverberated through the tower, vibrating the walls, making everything seem alive. And then, the air thickened even further, a sense of suffocating pressure building around us. It was closing in, and there was no escape. I turned, instinctively, reaching for the door, but it wouldn't open. It was as if it was stuck, as if something or someone was holding it shut from the other side. Panic gripped my chest, and I slammed my shoulder into it, trying to force it open, but it didn't budge. Derek rushed to my side, and together, we pushed against the door with all our might. But it remained immovable. The knocking continued, louder now, relentless, as if mocking our every attempt to leave. "Father Byrne," Mia gasped, her voice breaking. He's gone. What's happening to him?" I turned back toward the altar, but Father Byrne wasn't there. The place where he had stood just moments ago was empty. There was no trace of him, no sign that he had ever been there. But the handprint on his collar, the black, elongated fingers, was still burned into my memory. And the voice, the whisper, that had echoed through the room still lingered in my ears. "You shouldn't have come." The voice seemed to come from all around us now, as though the church itself was speaking, as if it had a voice that was older than time itself. My breath caught in my throat, and my mind screamed for me to wake up. This couldn't be happening. None of this made sense. Derek's hand was suddenly on my shoulder, and I looked at him, desperate for answers, for any kind of explanation. But his eyes were filled with fear, deep, primal fear that I had never seen in him before. His mouth moved, but no words came out. And then, we heard it. A loud crash from above. The bell tower had come to life. The bells, which had been silent for so long, suddenly rang out with a deafening clang. But this wasn't the normal sound of a bell. This was different. The bells sounded like a warning, like the church was trying to shake us to our very core. The noise was overwhelming, shaking the ground beneath us, rattling our teeth, making our vision blur with the intensity of it. Ryan screamed, stumbling backward into Mia, his face a mask of terror. "What's happening? What is this?" I didn't know what to say. I didn't have an explanation. But I knew we were running out of time. That's when I saw it, something in the shadows at the far end of the tower, something moving. At first, it was just a shape, a figure too dark to make out, but as it stepped closer I could see its features. It was tall, unnaturally tall, and its skin wasn't right. It was too pale, too stretched, and its limbs were long, too long, like they didn't belong. The face was an abstract blur, but I could see the eyes, black, soulless eyes that pierced through the darkness and locked onto mine. A cold, terrifying chill swept over me as I realized we weren't just dealing with a ghost or a poltergeist. This was something far older, far more dangerous. A force, an entity that had existed long before the church was built. Something that had been waiting for us, "Run," Derek whispered, his voice barely audible over the bells. "Now." We turned and bolted for the door again, our bodies moving on sheer instinct. But no matter how hard we tried, no matter how fast we ran, it was always just behind us, always just out of reach. We reached the stairs and I could feel the presence closing in, following us, getting closer with each step. And then, suddenly, the door to the bell tower flew open. Light flooded in, and we stumbled out into the night, gasping for air, as if the very act of leaving the church was a breath we hadn't been able to take in hours. The night was cold, too cold for early November. We ran through the cemetery, not looking back, not even daring to see if whatever had been waiting inside. The tower was still behind us. The church loomed in the distance, silent again, its dark silhouette standing against the sky like a giant watching us from afar. We made it back to Derek's car, and without saying a word, we piled in, slamming the door shut, as if that would somehow protect us from what we had just experienced. The engine roared to life, and we sped away from St. Ignatius, away from the town of Blackwater without a single glance back. The road stretched out in front of us, the headlights slicing through the night, but none of us spoke. We didn't need to. We all knew the truth now. That church was something more than just a building. It was a prison, and whatever had been waiting inside it, the thing we had woken up with our presence, was still there, watching. None of us ever spoke of that night again. But sometimes when I'm alone in the dark, I can hear it, the sound of footsteps dragging through the shadows, the soft, low knock. 3 taps, always at 11:23 p.m., and I know it's still out there, and it's still waiting. I still remember the first time I set foot in Aunt Rosie's decaying Victorian home, a place whispered about in every hushed conversation around town. I was 17, and my cousin Mateo had been warning me for years about the haunted reputation of that house in Blackthorn, Louisiana. Blackthorn wasn't like other towns. It was a small, sultry place where the humid air carried secrets, and every shadow seemed to hold a story of its own. Locals claimed the land was cursed, built over an old burial ground for victims of a long-forgotten fever epidemic. Those tales, often dismissed as superstitious ramblings, became disturbingly real during that summer. Aunt Rosie, or Rosalind Vasquez, as she was known in formal circles, had outlived her husband by many years and chose to live alone in that crumbling mansion on the edge of the Blackthorn swamp. The house itself was a character, a grand but deteriorating Victorian relic with peeling paint, warped floorboards, and windows that stared blankly like the eyes of long-dead souls. I remember the moment I first approached it. The air was heavy, almost oppressive, as if the house exhaled its despair onto anyone who dared come close. Mateo had always insisted that the property exuded an eerie energy, but I never truly believed him until I experienced it firsthand. When I arrived for what was meant to be a simple summer visit, I was greeted by the creak of the old iron gate and the thick scent of damp earth mixed with decay. Aunt Rosie, stooped with age and sorrow, barely smiled as she welcomed me inside. She moved about her home like a ghost, clinging to remnants of a past life. Dusty portraits, faded wallpaper, and antique furniture that seemed to whisper stories of better times. Despite the gloom, there was an undeniable beauty to the mansion, a tragic elegance that made it all the more haunting. Over the first few days, I explored every nook and cranny of the sprawling estate, trying to piece together its history through the memories left behind in old letters and photographs. Each room held secrets, and every creak of the floorboards made my skin crawl. I soon learned that the locals didn't just fear the house, they feared the land itself. Rumors abounded that the very soil was tainted, cursed by the blood of those forgotten by time. Mateo, ever the skeptic turned believer, would huddle me close at night, recounting bizarre occurrences he had experienced in the house. "You feel it, don't you?" he would whisper, eyes wide in the flickering light of our bedside candle. "That heavy, choking presence? That's not just your imagination." I tried to laugh it off at first, attributing it to nerves and the unsettling atmosphere of the old mansion, but soon I couldn't deny that something was off. Shadows lingered in places they shouldn't, and sometimes, when the wind was right, I heard faint whispers echoing through the halls, whispers that sounded like desperate pleas for help, or perhaps warnings. One humid evening, as the cicadas droned outside and the oppressive heat of the swamp pressed against the walls, I began to see signs that the curse was more than just a tale. A chill would sweep over me without warning, and the hairs on my arms would stand on end as I passed an old mirror in the corridor. In that mirror, I sometimes caught a glimpse of movement behind me, a fleeting figure that vanished when I turned around. I didn't yet know that this was only the beginning. As the days wore on and the humid nights deepened, the house would reveal more of its secrets. And in that slow, creeping way that nightmares do, the darkness in Blackthorn was about to come alive in ways I never could have imagined. I bolted upright in bed, heart hammering, every nerve alert. The silence was absolute, pressing down on me like a suffocating blanket. Sweat prickled at the base of my neck, dampening the sheets tangled around my legs. Something had startled me awake, something loud and jarring. Yet the silence now was almost more frightening than any noise could have been. I reached for my phone, fumbling with shaky fingers. The screen flickered to life, casting a weak, bluish glow over the cluttered bedroom I shared with Mateo. I saw him immediately, sitting upright in his bed across the room. His dark eyes were wide with terror, glistening in the dimness. "What?" I started to whisper, but Mateo frantically pressed a finger to his lips, shaking his head violently. His eyes shifted toward the door, and as I followed his gaze, dread pooled in the pit of my stomach. From the hallway came a sound, slow, deliberate footsteps echoing softly across the hardwood floor. Heavy, rhythmic thuds, unmistakably the sound of boots. My pulse quickened, every muscle in my body tightening as the footsteps moved closer to our room. Each step reverberated with dreadful intent. Mateo's eyes locked onto mine, the whites stark against his pale, clammy skin. He mouthed two words that sent chills down my spine. "It's back." Before I could process his words, before I could even try to understand, a figure appeared in the doorway. I froze completely, fear gripping me so tightly I couldn't breathe. Standing in the dim threshold was the dark silhouette of a man, tall and thin, impossibly elongated, his form draped in what seemed to be a long coat, his face obscured beneath the wide brim of a hat. The figure didn't move at first, simply watching us from beneath the shadow of that hat, radiating malevolence. The room grew colder, the air becoming thick, suffused with the nauseating stench of sulfur. Rotting eggs mixed with something sharp, metallic. It was a smell that lingered like a warning. The figure tilted its head slightly, and though I couldn't see its eyes, I felt its gaze on me, cold and penetrating. A scream built in my throat, desperate to escape, but Mateo reached out, his hand gripping my wrist with surprising strength. His voice was barely audible, trembling with suppressed panic. "Don't move," he whispered urgently. I couldn't have moved even if I'd wanted to. My limbs were paralyzed, my mind screaming at me to run, yet my body refused. I stared at the shadow, terrified that any slight movement would draw its attention closer. Then, slowly, deliberately, the figure began to move. It stepped forward, with silent precision, its form shifting eerily. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure it could hear me. Certain that my fear was palpable in the darkness, I braced myself, expecting it to move toward us, to reach out, to touch us with those unseen hands. But instead, it continued moving in a straight line, its dark form passing directly through the solid bedroom wall, vanishing silently without a trace. The moment it disappeared, the oppressive atmosphere began to lift, leaving behind only an echo of that terrible smell. Mateo finally released my wrist, breathing heavily, visibly shaken. What was that?" I finally managed to whisper, my voice breaking. Mateo looked exhausted, as if he'd just fought a losing battle. He shook his head weakly, his voice barely audible. "I told you, I've seen him before. He always comes at night, always in the hallway, always just watching." "But why?" My voice shook uncontrollably. "Who or what is it?" Mateo's gaze darted nervously toward the spot where the shadow had vanished. He drew a shuddering breath before responding. I don't know, but he appeared just like that, the night my dad died. My heart skipped a beat at his revelation. Uncle Santiago had died years earlier, suddenly and mysteriously. Aunt Rosie never spoke of the details. I'd always assumed it was grief that kept her silent. But now I wondered if it was fear. I couldn't sleep the rest of the night. Instead, I lay awake, listening to Mateo's labored breathing across the room, every creak of the old house setting my nerves on edge. I kept expecting to hear those footsteps again, to smell the foul odor of sulfur filling the air. But morning came slowly, washing away the shadows of the night with pale, watery sunlight. At dawn, Mateo and I silently agreed. We had to find out more about the shadow figure. There had to be some clue, something tangible that would explain what had happened. Cautiously, we stepped into the hallway, the morning sunlight doing little to dispel the eerie gloom. The house seemed to hold its breath around us, creaking quietly in protest as we moved. As we walked downstairs, Mateo froze suddenly, pointing to the back door. My eyes widened, my breath catching in my throat. There, burned clearly into the wood, was a charred handprint. It looked as if someone had pressed their palm into the door through flames, searing the outline deeply into the surface. The wood around it was blackened and peeling, and the unmistakable stench of sulfur clung stubbornly to the spot. "What the hell?" Mateo whispered, voice thick with fear. Behind us, Aunt Rosie appeared, her expression vacant yet filled with deep sorrow. Her gaze settled on the handprint for a brief, pained moment before she turned away, shaking her head slowly as though trying to push away memories too dark to face. "He was here before," she whispered. Her voice was barely audible, haunted by a terror I had never seen in her eyes before. "The night your uncle died." I stared at Mateo, heart hammering, finally understanding the depth of what we faced. The shadow in the hallway wasn't just a ghost or a trick of the imagination. It was something far older, far darker, and it was tied irrevocably to this house, to our family. And now, it knew us too. The day after the shadow appeared in the hallway, everything in Aunt Rosie's house felt heavier. It wasn't just the oppressive heat of a Louisiana summer, or the dampness that clung to the old walls. It was something else, something suffocating and dark. The handprint on the back door seemed to mock us, a clear sign that whatever we were dealing with wasn't just a figment of our imagination or a bad dream. That burned mark wasn't just a stain, it was a warning. I stood in the doorway, my fingers lightly brushing the charred edges of the print. It was deep, the lines seared into the wood like it had been pressed into a flame. The surrounding wood around the print was warped, as if the heat had come from inside the house and left a permanent mark. The smell of sulfur still clung to the air, sharp and pungent. I could taste it in the back of my throat, like a lingering aftertaste of something wrong. Mateo stood beside me, his expression unreadable as he studied the mark. He hadn't said much since Aunt Rosie's cryptic words, his usual sarcasm and dry humor nowhere to be found. I could see the familiar unease in his eyes, the same look he'd had the first time he spoke of the shadow figure. The same look I'd seen on my own face last night when we both realized that whatever was haunting the house was far worse than we could have ever imagined. Aunt Rosie hadn't said much more about the handprint. She'd left the room quietly, retreating to the kitchen as if trying to distance herself from the conversation. Her silence told me more than any words could have. She didn't want to confront the truth. I could tell she was holding something back, something painful, something tied to my uncle's sudden death. As we walked back toward the living room, Mateo finally spoke, his voice low and strained. "You saw it, right? You saw the shadow too?" Nodded, but my mind was still reeling. "Yeah, I saw it, but..." "What is it, Mateo? What's going on here?" He ran a hand through his dark hair, his eyes filled with the weight of years of fear and doubt. "I don't know, but I've seen him before. I told you that. Every year, around the time of Uncle Santiago's death, he shows up. It's like he's watching, waiting. And every time I see him, something bad happens." A chill ran down my spine at his words. I hadn't known about the regularity of the appearances. Mateo had always been cryptic about his experiences, never giving me much detail, but now it was clear that he had been living in fear of this thing long before I ever set foot in Blackthorn. I tried to push away the growing sense of dread creeping over me. Does Aunt Rosie know about the shadow? I asked, unsure if I wanted the answer. Mateo hesitated. She knows. She's the one who told me about him. After Dad died, she said she saw him too, but she doesn't talk about it, not anymore. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. Aunt Rosie had never mentioned any of this to me, but now I understood why she'd been so quick to shut down when we found the handprint. It wasn't just fear, it was grief. She had lived with this darkness long enough to know that it didn't just haunt the house, it haunted her. We sat down in the dusty living room, the air thick with silence. The ceiling fan above us creaked lazily, moving the heavy air just enough to keep us from suffocating. I glanced over at Mateo, whose eyes were fixed on the floor, deep in thought. After a long pause, he spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. I think it's tied to the land, to this house and to the swamp. The swamp? I repeated, my brows furrowing. Mateo nodded slowly. Yeah, the Blackthorn swamp. It's been here forever, and there's something wrong with it. The old people in town used to talk about it, about how people go missing around here. Like the land's hungry or cursed or something, and after the fever epidemic, it got worse. I sat back in my chair, trying to process everything he was saying. I had always heard whispers about the swamp, the strange disappearances that happened every few years. I never paid much attention until now. Now it felt like the missing pieces of a much larger puzzle were beginning to fall into place. So, this shadow, it's not just a ghost? It's tied to the land itself? I asked. Mateo's gaze darkened. I don't know for sure, but I've got a feeling it's something ancient, something older than the house, older than the fever, and whatever it is, it's been here a long time, waiting. The thought sent a shiver down my spine. The idea that this figure, this shadow, wasn't just a ghost or a manifestation of grief. It was something older, something that had been part of Blackthorn for centuries, filled me with an indescribable fear. And the worst part? It had waited for us. It had waited for me to come here, to this house, this cursed place. Later that afternoon, we decided to search the house for more answers. We'd seen the handprint, but we knew there had to be more. Something we hadn't uncovered yet. Some clue that would explain this. We spent hours combing through the old attic and the darkened basement, but we didn't find anything out of the ordinary. Just piles of old, forgotten things. Trunks filled with Aunt Rosie's wedding dresses, dusty furniture covered with moth-eaten sheets, and family heirlooms that had long since lost their value. But it was when we ventured outside, into the yard behind the house, that we found something that made my stomach churn. As we walked toward the edge of the property, where the land dipped into the thick, dark swamp, I noticed a cluster of old, weathered stones half buried in the overgrown grass. At first, I thought it was just debris, remnants of something long forgotten. But as I stepped closer, I realized that they were gravestones from a time before the house was even built. I knelt down, my heart pounding, and brushed away the dirt. The names on the stones were faded, but one was still legible. Jonas Vasquez died of the fever 1843. The name sent a jolt through me. Jonas Vasquez. That was Uncle Santiago's great-great-grandfather. And as I read the inscription, I realized something else. These gravestones were part of the original burial ground, the one the locals had spoken of, the one that supposedly cursed the land. I looked up at Mateo, who had come to stand beside me, his face pale. He didn't need to say anything. We both knew. Whatever had been haunting this house, whatever had been stalking us for years, was tied to the land itself. To the death, the disease, and the buried souls that had never been properly laid to rest. And now, It was after us. The discovery of the gravestones was the tipping point for me. I should have felt relief, maybe even hope, that we'd found something concrete, something that might explain the dark figure in the hallway, the sulfur smell, the burned handprint. But all I felt was dread and an overwhelming urge to leave Blackthorn and never return. Mateo and I stood there for a long moment, staring at the names on the gravestones, the weight of what we had uncovered pressing down on us. The house, the property, the land was cursed, and whatever had haunted it for generations was still there, waiting. We had come to Blackthorn to visit Aunt Rosie, but what we were really up against was something much bigger than us, something tied to the very earth beneath our feet. Why didn't Aunt Rosie ever tell us about this? I asked, my voice hoarse. I was still struggling to wrap my mind around everything we'd found. The shadow, the sulfur, the graves. Mateo kicked a loose stone with his boot, staring out toward the swamp. She probably doesn't want to talk about it, doesn't want to face it. I think she's been hiding from it her whole life. I couldn't argue with that. Aunt Rosie had lived in that house for as long as I could remember, and she never once mentioned the buried graves, the strange occurrences, or the fears that had plagued the family for generations. It was as if the house itself was a secret she had carried, a burden she couldn't share. "We need to talk to her," I said, trying to shake off the nagging feeling that this whole situation was spiraling beyond our control. "She knows more than she's letting on. She has to." Mateo hesitated, glancing back toward the house. I could see the reluctance in his eyes. "I don't think she's going to tell us anything. She's already given up on the house. She's barely holding on herself." Aunt Rosie had packed up most of her belongings and left just days after we found the burned handprint on the back door. She said she couldn't stay any longer, that it was time to move on. But the truth was, I think she was terrified. She had spent too many years living in fear of whatever was haunting that house, and when the shadow showed up again, it broke something inside her. I turned and walked back toward the house, Mateo following silently behind. The Victorian mansion loomed before us, its broken windows staring like hollow eyes. The once beautiful home had become a decaying monument to something ancient and vengeful. As we stepped onto the porch, I noticed the air had shifted. It was still thick with humidity, but there was something else. Something heavier, like the house was holding its breath, waiting for something. Inside, the house was still and silent, its rooms filled with shadows. There were no sounds of Aunt Rosie moving about, no scent of food cooking in the kitchen, no soft hum of the radio. The house felt empty, even though we knew she was somewhere inside, hiding from whatever it was that had driven her to leave everything behind. "Let's find her," I said, my voice firm despite the uncertainty gnawing at my insides. "We need to get some answers." We found Aunt Rosie in the living room, sitting in her favorite armchair, staring out the window at the overgrown yard. Her hands were folded in her lap, and her posture was slumped, as if the weight of years had finally caught up with her. She looked small, fragile, as though the house had sucked the life out of her. She didn't turn when we entered, but her eyes flickered briefly to Mateo. "You found them, didn't you?" Her voice was thin, tired, and resigned. Mateo nodded, stepping forward. "Aunt Rosie, we need to talk about the shadow, about the graves. What's really going on here?" She sighed deeply, a long, trembling exhale, and then finally turned to face us. There was no hiding it anymore. The fear in her eyes was clear, but it was also mixed with something else. Guilt. "I should have told you sooner," she said, her voice wavering. "I should have warned you both, but I didn't want you to know. I didn't want you to be part of this." "What do you mean?" I asked, my heart pounding faster as I tried to understand what she was saying. "The house. It's not just a house," she whispered, her gaze dropping to the floor. "It's built on cursed land, Sophia. It's always been cursed. Your great-great-grandfather, he didn't just die of fever, he made a deal." "A deal?" Mateo asked, his voice incredulous. She nodded slowly. "Yes. A long time ago, he struck a deal with something something that lived in the swamp, something that had always been there, long before the settlers came. And in exchange for protection, for prosperity, he agreed to give up the souls of his family. It was supposed to be a small price to pay, just a few lives here and there, in exchange for the land to thrive. But over the years the price grew higher and it became a cycle of death. And the shadow, the figure you saw, it's been here ever since, waiting. I felt my legs weaken, my knees buckling as the weight of her words hit me. A deal with something in the swamp, souls being traded for prosperity. It was beyond anything I had ever imagined, and yet everything about the house, the shadow, the sulfur, the handprint, made horrible sense now. It was all part of this ancient bargain that my family had unknowingly become trapped in. I didn't want you to come here, Aunt Rosie continued, her voice breaking. I didn't want you to see it. I didn't want you to be part of this, but the house, it's calling. And it's calling for you now, Sophia. It's always been your family. You're the last ones. I felt a coldness wash over me as she spoke. The last ones? What do you mean? The last to pay the price, Aunt Rosie whispered, her eyes filled with sorrow. The curse doesn't stop until the last soul is taken. And you, Sophia, you're the one it's waiting for. A chill settled over me, deeper and colder than anything I had felt before. I wanted to scream, to run, to tell Aunt Rosie that she was wrong. But deep down, I knew she wasn't. Whatever had been haunting this house, whatever had been tied to our family for generations, had finally found me. I was next. The weight of Aunt Rosie's words pressed down on me like a physical force. The house, the land, the curse. Everything I had believed was just an old family story, a superstitious relic, suddenly felt horribly real. I stood there in the living room, trying to process the nightmare my aunt had just unveiled. The shadows, in the corners of the room, felt alive now, watching me, waiting. The stench of sulfur, the burning handprint, the figure that had passed through our bedroom wall, all of it had been part of the same ancient, twisted pact. Aunt Rosie, this can't be real, I said, my voice shaking. It sounds like some kind of a folktale, a myth. You're telling me that this house was built on some kind of deal with what? A demon? A spirit? Something from the swamp? Her face was ashen, her tired eyes filled with an emotion I couldn't name, but I knew it was fear. Fear she had been carrying for so long that it had seeped into her very soul. Her hands trembled in her lap, and for a moment I saw her as the woman who had once been full of life, full of stories, but now she was a prisoner of the curse that had bound her to this place for far too long. No, she whispered, almost as if she were speaking to herself. It's not just a demon, it's older than that. The swamp, it's a gateway, a place where things from beyond the world we know can cross over. And my family made the mistake of giving them what they wanted. I shook my head in disbelief. But why? Why did they agree to something like that? Aunt Rosie's eyes filled with a deep sadness. Because they wanted power. The land here, it was barren, inhospitable. But your great-great-grandfather, he wanted to build something. He wanted to make the land prosperous. The swamp, it was the only way. The only way to make it happen. He thought it was harmless, thought he could control it. But once the deal was made, once the blood was spilled, it was too late. The price, it always grows. I could feel the hairs on my arms stand up, the weight of her words sinking into my bones. So the shadow, that's been following us. Following you is part of this? She nodded, her voice barely a whisper. Yes, it's a manifestation of the deal, a reminder of the price we paid. And every generation since then, it's been waiting for someone, waiting for the last one. The last one? Matteo asked, stepping forward. He had been silent for much of this conversation, but now he looked just as desperate for answers as I was. Aunt Rosie's voice dropped to a near murmur. It was supposed to be your father, Matteo. The shadow has always been drawn to the firstborn son. But when Santiago died, that night, when the shadow appeared again, it was a sign that it was never truly finished, and it's been waiting for you ever since. I felt dizzy. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what Aunt Rosie was saying. But it was like she had just opened a door to a world I couldn't comprehend. A world where dark forces from another plane held dominion over the fate of my family. I don't understand, I said, voice trembling. Why me? Why would it come for me? Aunt Rosie met my eyes, and for the first time I saw a flicker of hope in her gaze. Because you're the last one, Sophia. You're the last bloodline, and once it's taken, the cycle will be broken. I didn't know whether to scream or cry. What was I supposed to do with this knowledge? How could I stop something like this? Something that had been looming over my family for centuries. Aunt Rosie looked away, her face contorting with the grief of it all. I thought I could protect you, but it's here now, and there's nothing I can do to stop it. At that moment, I felt the air in the room change. The temperature seemed to drop, the oppressive humidity replaced by a sudden chill that made me shiver. The house groaned and creaked as if it were alive, like it was settling into something darker. And then I heard it. The faintest sound at first. A scraping, like boots dragging across the floor. I felt a cold rush of air, and I turned slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. There, standing in the hallway, was the shadow. The figure. It had returned. The tall, thin silhouette of a man in a long coat, his face still obscured beneath the wide brim of a hat. This time, however, it didn't hesitate. It stepped forward, its presence filling the doorway, blocking our only escape. The air thickened and the sulphurous stench hit my nose again, sharp and unbearable. Matteo moved beside me, his eyes wide with terror. "It's here," he whispered, voice cracking. I didn't know what to do. The figure stepped closer, and I could feel its gaze on me even though its face was still hidden in shadow. It didn't speak. It didn't need to. And then, in a voice that wasn't mine, a voice that came from deep within me, I heard myself speak. "I know what you want." The figure paused. I took a step forward, feeling something inside me stir. An ancient force, a bloodline's obligation, something that had been buried deep within me for years. I didn't understand it, but I felt it, and it felt like power. "I refuse," I said, my voice growing stronger. "I refuse to be part of this curse anymore." The figure tilted its head, as if considering my words. And then, without another sound, it began to fade, dissolving back into the shadows, its form vanishing as if it were never there at all. I stood there, breathless, every muscle trembling. The house was still again, the air heavy with silence. Aunt Rosie let out a shuddering breath. You did it," she whispered, disbelief in her voice. I didn't know how or why I had done it. But the moment the shadow disappeared, I knew that whatever had been holding my family in its grip had loosened. I wasn't sure if I had broken the curse or if it had simply moved on, but for the first time in my life I felt free. I felt like the house, the land, had lost its power over me. We left Blackthorn the next day. Aunt Rosie moved far away, and Matteo and I, for the first time in years, spoke about our futures without the shadow of the house looming over us. But sometimes, on nights when the air is thick and still, when the darkness feels too heavy, I still smell the sulfur. I still feel the weight of the house on my shoulders. And when I close my eyes, I sometimes hear the sound of boots dragging across the floor, waiting. They say hindsight is 20/20, but if I could go back to 2018, I'd slap myself for ever thinking Blackwood Heights was just a little rundown. That building was cursed. I know how that sounds. Like some cheap urban legend people whisper to scare new tenants. But it wasn't the creaking pipes or flickering lights that got to me. It was the silence, the kind that felt heavy, like it was listening. Back then I was 29, doing night shifts at Mill Creek General, running between floors and dealing with patients who smelled like copper and ammonia, and the end of something. My husband Daniel was an auto mechanic, good with his hands, always had grease under his nails even after scrubbing. We'd been married 6 years, stable, boring kind of love, the kind you could fall asleep in. And then there was Lily. 4 years old, too smart for her own good. She'd started reading signs before she could write her name and had this eerie way of saying things like, "Mommy, there's a man in the wall," and then going back to coloring like she hadn't just frozen my spine. Kids say weird things. You brush it off, you have to. When we moved into apartment 3B, we weren't looking for perfect, just somewhere cheap and close to work. The landlord, Mr. Ferris, handed us the keys like he was handing over a dead thing. "You'll hear stories," he said. "Ignore 'em, just old tenant talk." I remember Daniel smirking at that. "We're not exactly superstitious," he'd joked. The place had this yellowish carpet that smelled like wet dog no matter how many times I vacuumed, and the radiator clanged like a pipe organ on bad days. But it was ours, for what it was. Worth. Lily liked the window in her room. It overlooked the alley and this crooked lamppost that flickered like it was winking at her. The weirdness started small. Cold patches that moved from room to room like they were looking for someone. One time Daniel swore he saw Lily sleepwalking at 2 a.m., just standing in the hallway, staring at the bathroom door. Only problem? She was in bed with me that night, and she hadn't moved an inch. We blamed the building, we blamed stress. We blamed everything except what we should have. Then there were the neighbors. The woman in 3A used to knock on our door every Sunday with a prayer book in one hand and a Bible in the other. She never smiled, just pressed her hand to the doorframe and muttered things in Spanish I couldn't quite catch. One day I asked her what she was doing. She said, "Keeping it in, keeping it from slipping through." I laughed at the time. Nervous, awkward. She didn't laugh back. Maintenance workers. Never stayed long. I went through 3 different guys in 6 months. One of them, a quiet guy named Rick, was fixing our ceiling fan and stopped dead mid-sentence. He just stared at the hallway and said, "You ever hear scratching in the vents? Like someone trying to crawl their way out?" Daniel told me later that Rick quit the next day, packed up and left town. By March, I'd gotten used to sleeping with the hallway light on. Not for Lily's sake, she'd stopped being scared. Said the shadows in her room were nice to her now. No, I kept the light on because every time the apartment got too quiet, I could swear I heard breathing that wasn't ours. Then came March 18th, and nothing was ever the same after that. I woke up at 3:12 a.m. on the dot. I remember because I glanced at the glowing red numbers on the cheap alarm clock we kept on the nightstand. It was still dark outside, and the streetlight cast this watery orange glow across the bedroom. The kind that makes everything look a little distorted, like you're underwater. I'd been dreaming of something awful. I can't remember all of it now, but I know it involved something dragging its fingers down my spine. Not scratching, dragging. Like whatever it was, wanted me. To feel it, to know it was there. Daniel wasn't in bed. At first I figured he'd gotten up to use the bathroom. It wasn't unusual. He'd started having trouble sleeping around February. Said he kept waking up cold, like someone had pulled the covers off him. We joked it was the ghost of the heating bill. But that night something felt off. I could feel it before I even opened my eyes all the way. The apartment was dead quiet except for the slow, maddening drip from the kitchen faucet. That thing had been leaking for weeks and Daniel kept forgetting to fix it. Then I heard breathing. Not mine, not Lily's. Slow, wet, heavy. It wasn't the kind of breathing someone makes when they're asleep or even sick. It sounded like whoever was making it was trying to remember how lungs worked. I sat up, my mouth already dry. And there he was, Daniel, standing in the bedroom doorway, not moving, not saying a word, just staring at me. Or maybe through me, I couldn't tell. "Babe?" I whispered. No answer. He didn't shift, didn't blink. Nothing. "Daniel?" I said again, louder this time. Then, his head tilted. Not like a curious tilt. Not natural. It jerked sideways way too far, like his neck had no bones in it. Like a damn broken puppet. And when he spoke, it wasn't his voice. "She's hungry," it rasped. That voice was low and wet, like it came from the bottom of a clogged drain. It didn't sound like it belonged in a human throat. That's when I noticed it, Lily's bedroom door. It was open. I don't even remember getting out of bed. I just remember the cold rush of panic crashing over me as I sprinted past the figure in the doorway. I half expected it to reach out, grab me, pull me back, but it didn't move, just watched. Lily was sitting up in bed when I got to her room, her stuffed giraffe clutched tight in both arms. She looked confused, not scared, just confused, like she was trying to figure out why I was crying. "Mommy," she said. I scooped her up without answering and bolted. But when I ran back into the hallway, Daniel was gone. Gone. I checked every room. Living room, kitchen, even under the bed like some idiot horror movie cliche. I was talking to myself the whole time, telling myself it was a sleepwalking episode. Maybe a nightmare. Maybe both. But nothing made sense. I clutched Lily to my chest and crept toward the bathroom. That was the only place left. The door was shut, locked, and here's the part that still keeps me up at night. That lock had been broken since January. We jammed a hand towel into the crack just to keep it from swinging open. Daniel even laughed about it, said it was the only privacy we'd ever get with a 4-year-old. But it was locked. I banged on the door, yelling his name. He didn't answer. When it finally creaked open, he looked like hell, pale, sweaty, confused. "What the hell's going on?" he asked, rubbing his eyes. "Why are you crying?" He swore up and down he'd been asleep in the tub. He didn't remember hearing me scream. Didn't remember standing in the doorway. Didn't even remember getting up. And then I saw the mirror. It was fogged over, even though no one had taken a shower. But through the haze, something had been scrawled across the glass in something thick, dark, almost black. 2 words, feed Harry. Didn't sleep after that. Neither did Daniel. Lily knocked out again within an hour somehow, curled up between us in bed. I laid there stiff as a board, staring at the ceiling, listening to her soft breathing. Every time Daniel shifted, my whole body tensed up. I didn't want to admit it, not even to myself, but I was afraid of my own husband. He kept asking me what had happened, what I saw. But every time I started to tell him, I saw this look in his eyes like he didn't believe me. Not exactly. He wasn't saying I was lying, but it was like he thought I'd had some stress dream. Maybe I was seeing things. Maybe I'd imagined the voice, but I didn't imagine that mirror. He said he didn't write it, didn't even see it. By the time I dragged him back into the bathroom, the words had already faded. The condensation was gone, like someone wiped it clean. And the sticky stuff, whatever it was, had disappeared. No smears, no smell, nothing. He kept trying to rationalize it. Maybe I wrote it in my sleep. Maybe Lily did it somehow. Maybe it was old and we just never noticed. I didn't say anything. I didn't want to argue. But the whole thing felt like walking around with a mouthful of broken glass. Every second I was waiting to bleed. By morning I felt like I'd aged 10 years. The apartment looked the same as it always did, but I couldn't shake the sense that something had shifted, that something had opened. The hallway felt colder. The living room smelled off. Not foul exactly, just wrong, like wet carpet and warm metal. I sat in the kitchen with a cup of stale coffee, barely touched it. Daniel sat across from me, scrolling through his phone like it was a lifeline. I called in, he finally said. Took the day off. I nodded. He waited a beat. Then carefully, like he was stepping on glass. "You want to talk about it?" I looked out the kitchen window. The view was nothing but the rusted fire escape and the back wall of the next building. Cracks in the brick, peeling paint. A bird with a busted wing hopping along the ledge. Everything looked like it had given up. "No," I said. And I didn't. Not to him, not to anyone. I didn't want some forced conversation where he tried to make sense of something I knew damn well had no sense. He kept pressing. "You really think I was standing in the doorway?" I didn't answer. He leaned forward. Elena, you're scaring me. If I did something, if I was sleepwalking or... You weren't sleepwalking, I snapped. He went quiet. I immediately felt bad, but I didn't take it back. Because deep down I wasn't convinced that thing was ever him. His face, sure. His body, maybe. But not him. We tried to get back to normal. Daniel made pancakes for Lily. She dumped syrup everywhere. We even laughed a little. But it was forced. Every smile felt borrowed. Every sound too loud. Around noon, I tried to take a nap on the couch. That's when I saw it. A wet handprint. Smack in the middle of the inside of the front window, like someone stood there pressing their palm against the glass. Too high for Lily to reach. Too wide to be mine. It was just there, glimmering in the sunlight like it was fresh. When I blinked, it was gone. That night, I packed a small bag with Lily's clothes, just in case. I didn't tell Daniel. I didn't know where we'd go, or when. I just needed to be ready, because I couldn't shake the feeling we'd let something in, and whatever it wasn't done with us yet. The next few days blurred together like a bad fever. I didn't talk to anyone. Not my mom, not my sister, not even the other moms in the building I used to trade leftover baby wipes with when Lily was still in diapers. I didn't want to explain anything, mostly because I didn't have the words. I wasn't even sure what had happened, but I knew one thing. Something had shifted in that apartment. Like a crack had opened up somewhere behind the drywall, and whatever was hiding inside had started leaking through. And Daniel, he changed too. Not all at once, just little things. Subtle. The kind of things you'd miss unless you were looking real close. He'd leave the bedroom in the middle of the night without saying anything. I'd wake up and he'd be gone, only to return 10-15 minutes later like nothing happened. When I asked where he went, he'd say he didn't remember getting up. I started sleeping with the hallway light on, just in case. One night, I got up and followed him. Didn't say anything, just slipped out of bed a few seconds after he did. I found him standing in Lily's doorway, not moving, just watching her sleep. His hands were down by his sides. His breathing was slow. Too slow. I thought maybe he was sleepwalking again, but when I whispered his name, he turned to look at me, and I swear to God his eyes were open. He blinked once, then smiled. Not a warm smile, not a Daniel smile. This was tight, mechanical, a copy of a smile, like someone who had watched humans do it and was trying to fake it. "Everything okay?" he asked. My throat tightened. "Yeah, just checking." He turned and walked back to the bedroom like nothing happened. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, Lily woke up crying, not whining, sobbing. I ran in thinking she'd fallen or something, but she was sitting up in bed completely fine except for the tears streaming down her cheeks. When I asked what was wrong, she said, "Daddy scared me." My stomach dropped. "When?" She wiped her nose. "Last night, he came in and stood right there." She pointed to the corner of her room near the old rocking horse we'd gotten off Facebook Marketplace. The one Daniel said we should throw out 100 times because the springs were busted. "What did he do?" She shook her head. He smiled, but not his smile. I didn't tell Daniel. I didn't want to. I didn't want to hear him say she must have dreamed it, or that maybe she just imagined it because of a movie or something at daycare. I knew what I'd seen. I knew what I felt. Instead, I drove Lily to my mom's the next day, told Daniel she needed a weekend with her grandma. He didn't fight it. Just nodded, kissed her goodbye, and waved from the door. When I came back to the apartment alone, something felt off. The windows were all closed, but the air inside felt humid, sticky, like something had been breathing in there too long, and there was this smell, metallic, damp. I found Daniel asleep on the couch, fully dressed, the TV still playing some old rerun. I thought about waking him, but something told me not to. Instead, I walked into the bathroom, and there it was again. The Mirror was fogged up, impossible since the bathroom hadn't been used in hours. And in the fog, smeared with what looked like greasy fingerprints, were the same two words. Feed. Her this time it was written lower, like a child had done it. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just backed out slowly, closed the door, and went to the kitchen. I sat at the table for hours, staring at nothing, listening to Daniel snore softly from the couch. That night, I locked the bedroom door from the inside and kept a knife under my pillow, not because I thought Daniel would hurt me, but because I wasn't sure if the thing sleeping in my apartment was still my husband. And deep down, I had this awful feeling. Whatever had worn his face that night, it hadn't left. It was still here, just waiting. The night I decided to leave wasn't dramatic. It wasn't like in the movies, no thunder, no screaming matches. Just this quiet, gnawing certainty in my chest that if I stayed one more night, something would break. Me, maybe. Or Lily. Daniel had gone out to get dinner. Chinese. He'd asked if I wanted orange chicken like always, but his voice, it didn't sound quite right, like he was quoting something he'd heard 1,000 times but didn't know what it meant anymore. I didn't answer him. When he left, I grabbed a trash bag from under the sink and started packing Lily's clothes. Not even folding, just shoving them in. I grabbed her favorite blanket, the one with the bunnies on it, and the little unicorn nightlight she refused to sleep without. I didn't even think about packing my own stuff. I just wanted her out of there. I was halfway through when the front door opened. I froze. He was back too soon. Too soon. Elena? His voice came from the hall. Cheerful. Light. Footsteps followed. Not heavy. Slow. Careful. I stayed in Lily's room. Quiet. Still. Holding that damn nightlight like it would protect me. Elena? He said again. Closer now. Then I heard something drop. A bag, maybe. The rustle of plastic. The sound of keys hitting the entryway table, and then silence. Long, stretched-out silence. I held my breath. Then, I brought food, he said, voice low now, flat. Lily hungry? He didn't say, is Lily hungry? He said it like a statement, like a suggestion. I stepped out into the hallway. He was standing there, back turned, head slightly tilted, like he was listening to something behind him, something inside him. You, okay? I asked. He turned around slow. His eyes looked wrong, too wide, too shiny. He smiled. She's been fed, he said softly. Now it's your turn. The hallway light flickered, not like a horror movie flicker, just once, like the bulb was dying. But that was enough. I turned and ran. I didn't stop to explain. I didn't cry. I didn't beg. I grabbed Lily's bag and ran down the stairs barefoot, still in my sweats. I drove to my mom's that night, told her Daniel had had a breakdown, that I needed space. I didn't tell her about the thing in the hallway, the voice, the smile, the wrongness. I just said, I'm scared. And that was enough. Daniel called, once left a voicemail, said he didn't understand what happened, that he woke up on the couch and the apartment was empty. He sounded like himself. But I didn't call back. I never went back to apartment 3B. A week later, someone from the building called me. They were clearing out the unit, said there was something. I might want to come pick up Lily's rocking horse. I told them no, they could toss it. They hesitated, said they found something carved into the wood under the seat. I asked what it was. The woman on the phone got quiet. Then she read it out. She's still hungry. I hung up. 5 years have passed since then. I remarried. Lily's 9 now. She doesn't remember any of it. Or maybe she does, and just doesn't talk about it. Sometimes I catch her staring out the window late at night. When I ask her what she's looking at, she always says the same thing. Nothing. But some nights when it's real quiet, when the whole world feels asleep except for me, I'll hear it. A drip from the kitchen faucet that isn't leaking. Sound like breathing from the hallway, or a voice low and far away humming Lily's favorite lullaby. And sometimes, just sometimes, I'll wake up and Daniel will be there. Not the real Daniel, the other one, standing at the foot of my bed, smiling. And I know it's not real. I know he's gone. But I still lock my door at night, because I think whatever it was back then, it never left. It just found a new face to wear. I was 24 years old when my father, Hector Castillo, died suddenly. October 2019. No warning. No illness. One moment he was at work, doing his usual thing, and the next, he was gone. Just like that. A collapsed aneurysm, the doctors said. But I've always believed there was more to it. The autopsy report gave a clinical explanation. But my grandmother, abuela as we called her, muttered about bad blood and things that follow grief. That phrase stuck with me, gnawing at my mind long after the funeral. A cold whisper I couldn't shake. We had lived in Blackwater, Maine for as long as I could remember. A small, fog-shrouded town where the woods pressed too close and the air was always thick with the scent of damp pine. Our house, a weathered two-story colonial, sat on a quiet street lined with sagging fences and overgrown lawns. It was old, creaking with age, but we had always loved it. The kind of house that felt lived in, that had witnessed generations of our family. It had history, or so we thought. When Dad died, something in that house changed. Something we couldn't explain. And my mother Carmen refused to acknowledge. She tried to keep everything normal, as if continuing our routines could somehow reverse the awful reality we were all suddenly thrust into. But it didn't work. 3 days after the funeral, the noises began. At first, it was small, a distant sound that we could have easily dismissed. But when the knock started, it felt as though something had settled into the house with us. Something we didn't invite, but that was here anyway. The first time it happened, I thought I had imagined it. I woke up to 3 sharp raps on my bedroom door, knocks that echoed in the silence of the night. I bolted upright, my heart pounding, and instinctively looked at the clock. 2:17 a.m. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had heard those knocks before, somewhere in the recesses of my mind. I got up, my legs weak from the sudden panic, and opened the door to find nothing. No one in the hallway, no sign of anything unusual, just the faint smell of my father's cologne, something I had been so used to in his presence. The next morning, I asked my mom about it. She was in the kitchen still wearing the clothes from the funeral, staring into the sink. It was probably just the house settling, she said dismissively, her voice tinged with fatigue. Old houses do that. I wanted to believe her, I really did. But the knocking didn't stop. It came every night. 3 knocks, always at 2:17 a.m. No matter what. It was as if time itself had stopped in that moment, trapped in a loop. I couldn't understand it, and neither could Mom, but it was happening and we had no choice but to endure it. A few nights later, something even stranger occurred. My little sister Lola, who was 7 at the time, came into my room late one night. Her small, frightened face was pale, her eyes wide and filled with confusion. Poppy's standing in the hallway, she whispered, her voice trembling. I looked at her, trying to hide the shock that suddenly gripped me. I told her she was dreaming, that it was just a figment of her imagination, but when I went to the hallway to check, there was nothing. Just the same old shadows, the same dark corners of our home. But the air in the hallway, heavy, thick, smelled like Dad's cologne again. Stronger this time, as if he were standing right there, just out of sight. That's when I began to feel it. The grief in the walls. It wasn't just the sadness of losing my father, although that grief was heavy enough to drag us all under. No, it was something else. Something that had entered our home with him. Something that now clung to the rooms, the floors, the air we breathed. I didn't know it yet, but the house had begun to grieve with us, and I wasn't sure if it was going to be the thing that saved us, or the thing that would consume us. The knocking didn't stop. No matter how many nights passed, no matter how many times I told myself it was just the house settling, no matter how much I tried to convince myself it was nothing, the knocks kept coming. 3 sharp raps, always at exactly 2:17 a.m. It was maddening. Every night without fail, I would be jolted awake, my heart pounding, the sound of those knocks reverberating in my ears as if they were coming from inside my own head. I would lie, there in the darkness, holding my breath, waiting for them to come again, feeling my body tense as I tried to brace myself for it. It felt like the house itself was alive, watching me, waiting. At first, it was easy to ignore. After all, I'd been raised with stories of old houses that creaked and groaned with age. But these knocks, these were different. They weren't the soft, settling sounds that come with an old home. They were deliberate. They were purposeful. One night, after another sleepless hour spent staring at the ceiling, I finally decided to confront it. The knocking had been relentless for days, and I was no longer willing to just let it continue. I got out of bed, trying not to wake Lola, who was curled up in the corner of the room, and I opened the door. The hallway was dark. I walked into it, moving quietly, my heart racing. I don't know why I was so afraid to look, but the closer I got to the source of the sound, the more I felt something was wrong, as if I was about to stumble upon something I wasn't meant to see. And then, just as I reached the end of the hallway, it happened. The knocks came again. 3 raps, sharp and deliberate. They echoed off the walls and filled the air around me. But when I turned to face the door, nothing was there. I stood frozen for a moment, my breath caught in my throat. I had expected to see something, someone, but no one was there. Just the empty space, just the same quiet hallway, with its faded wallpaper and dusty floors. But something was different now. The air felt colder, heavier. I reached out to touch the doorknob, but my hand hesitated just before it made contact. Something in me, a feeling deep in my chest, told me not to touch it. Something was wrong, something beyond the knocks. The smell of my father's cologne was in the air again, thick and unmistakable. It was so strong that it made my stomach churn. But my father wasn't there. He couldn't be. He was gone. Yet the scent lingered, wrapping itself around me like a cold, haunting embrace. And for the first time since his death, I felt truly scared. It wasn't just the grief, it wasn't just the mourning of a lost father. This was something else, something darker. I turned back to my room, my heart beating so loudly in my chest that I could hear it in my ears. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but deep down I knew it wasn't. Something had crossed over with my father's death, something that wasn't ready to leave. The knocking continued each night at 2:17 a.m. It became a ritual I could no longer ignore. But even more unsettling was the smell. It became more frequent, stronger. There were nights when I'd walk through the hallway, and it would hit me like a punch to the stomach. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck rise, my body stiffen. It was as though the house itself was reaching out to me, beckoning me to understand something I wasn't ready to comprehend. I tried to talk to my mom about it, but she brushed it off. She didn't want to deal with it. She didn't want to admit that something might be wrong in the house. "It's just the house settling, Mia. Nothing more," she would say, her voice tired and distracted. She hadn't been sleeping much either, but I think part of her didn't want to acknowledge the truth. She had her own grief to deal with, her own pain. But Lola wasn't like Mom. She didn't try to brush things off or pretend everything was normal. One night she came into my room, her little face pale and wide-eyed. She whispered something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "Poppy's standing in the hallway," she said, her voice quivering with fear. I froze. I knew Lola wasn't lying. She wasn't old enough to make things up like that. I got up quickly, heart racing, and opened the door to the hallway. But there was no one there, just the usual darkness. "I don't see him, Lola," I said, trying to sound reassuring. even though the words felt hollow in my throat. "There's no one there." Lola looked at me, her big brown eyes filled with confusion and fear. "He's there, Mia. He's standing right there." I followed her gaze. Nothing. No figure. No shape. But the air in the hallway was heavy, thick with something I couldn't explain. I turned back to her, trying to shake the fear that had started to grow in my chest. "I don't know what you saw, baby," I said softly. "But it wasn't Poppy. He's gone." But even as I said the words, I knew they weren't true. The knocking, the cologne, Lola's words, they all pointed to something else. Something that had followed us home. Something that had crossed the line between the living and the dead. And the worst part, I didn't know how to make it stop. In January 2020, after the knocks had gotten worse, after the strange occurrences had become harder to dismiss, we moved out. My mother, desperate for a change of scene, found a small rental house on the other side of Blackwater. The place was nothing special. 2 bedrooms, a cramped living room, and a kitchen that was barely big enough for the 3 of us to move around in. But it was a fresh start, or at least that's what we hoped for. I thought a new house, a new environment would help us escape whatever lingered in the old place. I thought maybe, if we could just put some distance between ourselves and the house Dad had died in, we'd feel like a family again, that we could begin healing. But healing isn't that simple. The grief didn't stay behind in the old house, and whatever had been attached to our family, whatever had followed us home, didn't stay behind either. I should have known that moving didn't solve anything. The first night in the new house, I felt the weight of it all, the change, the unfamiliarity, the silence. There were no knocks this time, no smells of cologne in the air, but the house felt just as cold, just as empty as the one we had left. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me, or maybe it was the exhaustion of the last few months, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It didn't take long for the footsteps to start. It was the first night, actually. Lola had gone to bed early, exhausted from the move, and my mom had retreated to the kitchen trying to unpack a few boxes. I was alone in the living room, curled up on the couch with a blanket, scrolling through my phone, trying to tune out the sound of boxes being shuffled around in the other room. My mind kept drifting back to the old house, to Dad, to the knocking, to Lola's frightened whispers. And then I heard it. Slow, deliberate footsteps pacing down the hallway. They weren't soft, like someone walking lightly through a house. No, these were heavy, distinct. They had a rhythm to them, as if someone was walking on purpose. They were so loud that they couldn't have been a trick of the mind. My heart raced as I listened. Step, pause, step, pause. I froze, gripping the edge of the couch. My mind screamed at me to get up, to check it out, to confront whatever was making those sounds. But my body refused to move. I was rooted in place, paralyzed by fear. The footsteps continued, slow and measured, as if someone was walking up and down the hallway just outside the living room. My first instinct was to go check on Lola, make sure she was okay, maybe make her feel safe. But I couldn't tear myself away from the noise. It was like a part of me needed to know what was happening before I could even think about anything else. I crept to the hallway, my phone trembling in my hand, the light from the screen barely cutting through the darkness. I stood at the edge of the door, my breath coming in shallow gasps as I listened, straining to hear. The footsteps stopped. I held my breath, waiting. The house was completely still, and for a moment I thought I'd imagined the whole thing. But then I heard it again. A breath. A cold breath, as if someone had exhaled just behind me. I froze, feeling the hairs on my neck stand up. My stomach twisted into a knot, and I spun around quickly, expecting to see someone standing in the hallway. But there was no one. The room felt suddenly colder, the air thick with a presence I couldn't see but could feel pressing against me. My skin prickled as if something was right there, just out of sight. And then I heard it again, my father's voice. Mija. It was so faint, so quiet, but I knew that voice. I'd heard it 1,000 times before, and it was coming from the direction of Lola's room. I turned sharply, my mind racing with questions. What was happening? Why was I hearing Dad? Was this just grief? Was I imagining it? I rushed toward Lola's room, my pulse pounding in my ears. But when I opened the door, I was greeted with an empty, cold room. Lola was fast asleep in her bed, her small body curled up beneath the covers. No one else was there, but the temperature in the room had dropped. It was icy, the kind of cold that sinks into your bones. I could see my breath as I stepped into the room, and I shivered involuntarily. I reached for the light switch, my hand trembling as I flicked it on. The light illuminated the room, casting long shadows across the walls. And then I saw it. On the wall beside Lola's bed were 3 finger marks, not smudges. Finger marks, deep and unmistakable. They looked as though something had dragged itself through wet paint. The wall was streaked like the marks had been left by someone or something crawling along the surface. I felt my blood run cold. This wasn't normal. This wasn't just grief or my mind playing tricks on me. Whatever had followed us from the old house, whatever had attached itself to us, was still here, and it was getting stronger. I backed out of the room slowly, my heart in my throat. My mind raced with questions, but I didn't have answers. I didn't even know what was real anymore. I stayed up the rest of the night watching Lola sleep, terrified that whatever had left those marks was going to come for her. But the rest of the night passed without incident. No footsteps, no breath. No more signs of my father, at least not in any way that I could explain. But the feeling, the heaviness lingered. It followed me from room to room, pressing down on me like a weight I couldn't shake. When my mother came in the next morning, she didn't seem to notice the change. She was busy, unpacking, making breakfast. Her mind was still preoccupied, with the mountain of tasks ahead, trying to make this new place feel like home. She didn't notice how the walls seemed to close in on me, or how the air felt wrong. And I didn't know how to tell her. I didn't know how to tell her that whatever had followed us here wasn't going away, that my father's death had opened a door, and now something else had stepped through. Whatever it wasn't finished with us yet. By the time March rolled around, I was running on fumes. The weeks since we'd moved into the rental house had felt like a blur, full of uneasy silences, cold drafts, and my mind constantly circling back to what had happened in the old house. I had tried to convince myself it was just stress, just the weight of losing Dad. But the house had been different from the moment we stepped inside. The knocking had stopped, but that didn't mean the house had let go. It was like we were all being pulled into something we didn't understand, something that no one could explain away. I wasn't the only one who had been feeling it. Lola, who had always been sensitive in her own way, had started talking more and more about Poppy as though he were still with us. Sometimes she would stare at the corner of the room, her tiny face serious, and I'd catch her talking to someone I couldn't see. My mother was just as uneasy, though she did her best to hide it. She tried to maintain the appearance of normalcy, cooking, dinner, taking us out to the park, staying busy with work. But I could see it in her eyes. Her grief was just as deep as mine, but unlike me, she buried it under layers of distraction. I knew I had to do something. I couldn't ignore what was happening anymore. That's when Aunt Rosa stepped in. Aunt Rosa wasn't the kind of person you invited for small talk over tea. She was a woman of faith, but not the kind you'd expect to see sitting in a pew at church every Sunday. No, Aunt Rosa was the kind of person who had conversations with saints and spirits, who believed in the old ways. She had always been like that, ever since I was a little girl. Whenever something unexplainable happened, she'd be the first to call a family gathering, the first to pull out the candles and sage, and the first to pray with words I didn't quite understand but that somehow still managed to calm me. So, when things started escalating in the new house, when I heard Dad's voice when the footsteps came back, Mom and I knew it was time to call Aunt Rosa. She arrived at the house late in the evening carrying a small satchel filled with items that looked foreign to me. Candles, bundles of sage, and small vials of oils I'd never seen before. She moved through the house like she knew it intimately, her hands brushing the door frames as she walked by, her eyes studying each room carefully. It was as if she could feel the energy in the house, something that had been lingering for far too long. "We need to close the door," Aunt Rosa said, her voice grave as she turned to face me and my mother. "The spirits in this house, they're restless. Hector's not at peace, and the door is open. He's stuck." I glanced at Mom, who hadn't spoken a word since Aunt Rosa's arrival. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow from sleepless nights, but she nodded silently, as if she knew this had been coming. I could see the weight of it all in her shoulders, the grief, the guilt, the fear. Aunt Rosa began preparing the room. She set up a circle of candles around the living room, her movements deliberate. There was a tension in the air, thick and charged with something unspoken. Lola sat on the couch, her legs tucked under her, watching her aunt intently while Mom and I stood behind her, uncertain but willing to try anything. Aunt Rosa spoke in a low, soft voice, her words flowing in a mixture of Spanish and ancient prayers. She lit the candles one by one, the flames flickering in the stillness of the room. As she did, I felt a strange shift in the atmosphere. The air grew thick again, just like in the old house, and I could taste the scent of my father's cologne, lingering in the corners. It was too real, too vivid, like he was just out of sight, standing right next to me. When Aunt Rosa finished her preparations, she stepped into the center of the circle, closing her eyes and placing her hands in front of her chest in a prayerful pose. She muttered more words, her voice barely audible, a rhythm that almost seemed to hum through the air. I looked over at Lola, who was sitting motionless, her gaze fixed on Aunt Rosa. Her little hands were clasped tightly in her lap. I wondered if she was aware of what was happening or if she was just following the ritual in her own innocent way. Then came the words that would change everything. "Hector, váyase en paz," Aunt Rosa whispered, her voice breaking the silence. "Hector, go in peace." As soon as she spoke those words, the lights in the room flickered, first once, then again, and then they began to strobe, flickering madly as if they were about to burn out. The candles in front of Aunt Rosa wavered, violently, the flames bending and flickering, casting long, eerie shadows against the walls. The air seemed to thicken even more, pressing in on me. My heart raced as I stood frozen, watching the room twist in a way I couldn't explain. Something was happening, something powerful, something beyond our control. Lola screamed suddenly, her little voice high-pitched and desperate. "He's crying!" she cried, her hands clutching her ears as she rocked back and forth. The sound of crying, low, mournful, filled the room, but it wasn't coming from Lola. It wasn't coming from anyone. It was the sound of grief, raw and painful, and it seemed to echo in the walls, vibrating through the very floorboards beneath us. I turned to my mother, but she was frozen in place, her eyes wide with terror. She didn't move, didn't speak. Then, in that instant, I felt it, a cold brush against my cheek, fingers so faint and cold they could have been made of ice. I gasped and jerked away, my breath catching in my throat. I felt it again, but this time it was stronger, more insistent. The candles snuffed out, plunging the room into darkness. The air was suffocating, thick with something I couldn't name. It felt like we were being watched, like there was something hovering just beyond our reach, something powerful, something ancient. Aunt Rosa stood, her hands still raised as though she were holding on to the unseen. Her face was pale, sweat beading on her forehead, but her voice remained steady. "Hector, váyase en paz," she repeated, louder this time, her voice booming with authority. "Go in peace." And with that, the temperature in the room shifted. The air lightened, the weight lifting from my chest. The crying stopped and the lights flickered one last time before coming back on, steady and bright. The room was still. Silence hung heavily in the air. It was over. Lola stopped rocking and stood up slowly, her eyes wide. "Is Papi gone?" she asked, her voice so small. Aunt Rosa nodded, but she didn't speak for a long time. I didn't know what to say either, so I just stood there, my hands still trembling. My heart was racing, but the tension in the room had dissolved. It felt like something had been lifted, something that had been holding us in its grip for so long. But I wasn't sure if the house was truly at peace, or if the door had simply been closed, only to be opened again when we least expected it. In the days following the seance, something inside me shifted. The house, while still heavy with the weight of grief, seemed to breathe a little easier. The air no longer felt suffocating, the silence no longer haunted by the echoing knocks or my father's scent. The crying had stopped, and the unsettling presence that had clung to us seemed to loosen, fading like the last wisps of a storm. For the first time in months, I began to feel a small glimmer of hope. I didn't want to believe that Aunt Rosa had closed some kind of spiritual door, but the changes in the house were undeniable. The air felt lighter, and the heaviness that had been pressing down on us lifted. For the first time, I started to think we might actually be able to move on. But peace, as it often does, proved fleeting. It started with little things, small, innocuous things that wouldn't have seemed significant if you didn't already know the history of our family's grief. The first time I passed my father's old armchair, the leather creaked, like someone had just gotten up, shifting their weight. I froze, staring at the chair for a long moment, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But nothing did. I turned away, telling myself it was just the house settling. After all, it was an old chair. But the second time it happened, I couldn't ignore it. I had been in the kitchen when I heard it, the same creak of leather, as if someone had shifted in the chair. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I turned slowly toward the living room. The chair was empty, as it always was when I passed it. But the sound of someone standing up, was unmistakable. I didn't want to believe it. I didn't want to acknowledge that the house was still holding on to something, still clinging to the echoes of my father's death. Then the smells returned. It wasn't as overpowering as it had been before, but I'd catch the faintest scent of my father's cologne when I walked past the hallway or into the kitchen. I could smell it on my clothes when I woke up in the morning. It wasn't just in my imagination. It wasn't just grief. The smell had become a fixture in the house, lingering in places it had no business being. It made me wonder, was Dad's spirit truly gone? Or had we just pushed him into the corners of the house, into a space we couldn't see but could still feel? And then there was Lola. Lola had always been a sensitive child, never afraid of the dark, always in tune with things I couldn't understand. But after the seance, she grew quieter, more withdrawn. She would still play, still laugh, but there was a distance in her eyes, as if she were seeing something that no one else could. I caught her talking to herself more often, especially in the mornings when she was by herself in the living room. I asked her who she was talking to, and she would shrug, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. "Poppy's checking on us," she'd say, her voice light and casual. But Lola hadn't seen Dad in months. He was gone, and she was only 7. I couldn't understand what she meant, but I could feel the weight of it hanging in the air. One evening, after a particularly long day of unpacking and cleaning, I decided to check on her before bed. She had been quiet all day, sitting in her room, staring out the window. I knocked softly on the door and opened it to find her standing by the window, her hands pressed against the glass. Her eyes were wide, and she was staring out into the dark woods behind the house. The night was thick with fog, the trees barely visible through the mist. "Lola," I called softly, stepping into the room. "What are you doing?" She turned to look at me, her face serene but unreadable. "I'm waiting for Poppy," she said, her voice calm, almost too calm. "He says he'll come back when we need him." I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breathing. The hairs on my neck prickled, and I felt that familiar chill in the air again, the feeling that we were being watched. But I didn't know how to explain it. I didn't know how to tell her that Poppy was gone, that whatever was lingering in this house wasn't him. "Lola," I whispered, kneeling beside her. "Poppy isn't coming back. He's gone." Lola didn't answer. She just turned back to the window, her little hands still pressed against the cold glass. She didn't even blink. The next few days were a blur of unease. I kept hearing sounds in the house, footsteps in the hallway at night, creaks and groans from the floors. But when I'd check, no one would be there. No footsteps, no shadow in the hall. It was as though my mind was playing tricks on me, or that maybe the grief was still working its way out of me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us, waiting for us to acknowledge it. And then, on the anniversary of Dad's death, it happened again. The house smelled like his cologne. It was unmistakable. The heavy, familiar scent that had once filled the halls whenever he came home. It clung to the furniture, to the air itself. And when I passed by his old chair, it creaked again, the same way it had the first time. Lola didn't say anything that day, but she kept looking toward the door, toward the hallway, as if she was expecting someone, as if she could see something I couldn't. That night I found myself standing in the hallway, staring at my father's old chair. My mind was racing, but I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what to think. And then I saw it. 3 new scratches, deep and jagged, marked the door to my bedroom. 3 scratches like something or someone had dragged their fingers down the wood, leaving deep grooves in the paint. I stepped back, my breath catching in my throat. The same pattern. 3 marks. It was too much. I couldn't explain it. I couldn't justify it away. The grief in this house was still alive. And whatever it was, whatever had followed us here, was still clinging to us, still holding on, refusing to let go. Lola was right. Poppy was still checking on us, but I wasn't sure anymore whether he was the one knocking on the door at 2:17 a.m., or if something else had taken his place. I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't closed the door after all. And now, whatever had been waiting for us, whatever had come with Dad's death, was here to stay. I didn't always have nightmares. Well, not this kind anyway. Sure, there were the usual ones. The ones where I'd fall off a cliff or my teeth would break apart in my mouth. But none of them ever felt like the dreams I started having a few weeks ago. They felt real. So real, in fact, that I wasn't sure if I was asleep or awake anymore. I'd always struggled with insomnia. It had been a part of me for as long as I could remember, that feeling of being awake when the world around me was lost in slumber. It was lonely, unnerving. But I'd learned to live with it. That was, until I moved into the loft above the abandoned bookstore in Black Harbor. The loft was perfect for someone like me. Quiet, secluded, and far from the prying eyes of a town that never quite felt like home. The bookstore below was a relic. Dusty shelves lined the walls, and the air was always thick with the smell of old paper. I liked the place, even if the history was a little too unsettling. The previous owner, an older man named William Blackwell, had reportedly hung himself from the rafters. People said it was the building that did it, the oppressive atmosphere of the place wearing him down over the years. But I didn't believe in ghosts. At least I didn't until recently. The dreams started shortly after I began taking the new sleep aid, Somnex 12. The pills came with a warning on the label: may cause vivid dreams. What they didn't mention was that the dreams might follow you into waking life, that they might bleed into reality in ways you couldn't explain. The first night, I didn't know what to expect. I'd been dealing with restless sleep for years, and the pills were my last-ditch effort to get a decent night's rest. I took the pill with some water and curled up in my bed, hoping for a peaceful sleep. And at first, it seemed to work. But then I woke up. The dream always started the same way. I would find myself in a vast cavern. No, not a cavern, a hollow, like the inside of something huge and living. The walls around me were made of pulsing, shifting flesh, like the inside of an enormous creature. The air smelled like burnt sugar, sickly sweet, almost suffocating. And then they'd come. The whisperers. These figures were gaunt and skeletal, their limbs too long, their joints twisting at unnatural angles. Their faces were covered with thin veils, but I could still make out the way their mouths were sewn shut, tightly, with strands of hair, human hair. I couldn't tell if it was their own hair or someone else's. They pointed towards something in the distance, something I could never fully make out. A flicker of red light far away, but always just out of reach. It was always the same. The whisperers pointing, their fingers like twisted branches, their eyes hollow. And then, the running man. He wasn't like the others. He was tall, too tall, with knees that bent backward. The way he moved was wrong, like he was sprinting in jagged bursts, too fast, too fluid, all at once. His skin was tight, stretched over his bones. His eyes were wide, too wide, black pools of emptiness that stared directly at me. I would always wake up just before he reached me. My heart would be pounding, my sheets soaked with sweat, and the fear would cling to me long after I opened my eyes. I'd blink a few times, tell myself it was just a dream. But something in me knew it wasn't just that. It was something more. The first few nights I brushed it off. I told myself it was the pills, that they were messing with my mind. But then, it kept happening, over and over again, every night. I couldn't escape it. By the fourth night, it was no longer just a dream. I felt like I was trapped in the hollow itself. But the worst part came the night after that. The dream was the same, but this time, I didn't wake up fast enough. I don't know how it happened exactly, but 1 second, I was watching the running. Man charged toward me, and the next thing I knew, his fingers were in my shoulders. Too many fingers. Too long. His face was inches from mine, his breath hot and acrid like burning wood and something foul. His forehead pressed against mine, and I could hear him whispering, no, hissing, in a language I didn't understand. "You're almost here," he said, his voice like gravel scraping against glass. And then, his breath. His breath smelled like my childhood home burning. The sensation of it, the heaviness of his touch was so vivid. It felt like I could still feel his fingers digging into me even after I woke up. But this time, I didn't wake up the way I usually did. The panic, the cold sweat, the gasping breath. It was all there, but there was something more. Something that made the dream feel realer than it had ever been before. I opened my eyes, gasping, my heart racing. But when I looked around the room, nothing was right. My bedroom was dark, but there was something on the walls. A dark liquid, dripping slowly down, pooling on the floor. I reached for the light, my hands shaking, and flicked it on. The walls were bleeding. I stumbled back, my throat dry, my mind racing. I had no idea what was happening. Was I still dreaming? Or was this real? And then, I saw it. In the mirror, written in something dark, something thick and sticky. 2 more nights. My legs went weak, and I sank to the floor. I didn't know what it meant, but I knew, deep in my gut, that it wasn't just a warning. It was a countdown. After the night I woke up to the blood on my walls, things only got worse. I thought maybe I could shake it off. I thought that maybe if I just didn't think about it, I could pretend nothing had happened. But it didn't work. I didn't want to tell anyone. God, I didn't even want to admit it to myself. I knew the truth deep down, and it terrified me. Whatever was happening to me, it wasn't normal. I started noticing changes almost immediately. Small ones at first, like little cracks in the world I thought I knew. I'd glance in the mirror and catch my reflection a split second after I moved, like I was lagging behind myself, like I wasn't quite in sync with who I was. At first I chalked it up to exhaustion, the lack of sleep. But when I looked closer, when I really focused on the details, I realized something wasn't right. One morning, I woke up, my face pressed against the pillow, the scent of sweat and stale sheets clinging to me. I didn't want to open my eyes. I was too scared to see the blood again, too scared to face what I knew was there. But I forced myself, peeling my eyelids open, the light harsh against my retinas. I walked to the bathroom, my feet heavy, my mind foggy. The mirror reflected the same tired, haggard face I had seen countless times before, but this time, something caught my attention. A flicker. My reflection blinked. It wasn't an exaggerated blink, like I was seeing it out of the corner of my eye or something. No, it was deliberate. It was like my reflection didn't match my actions. I blinked, and then a second later, my reflection blinked. It felt wrong, like I wasn't looking at myself anymore. I froze. My heart skipped a beat. I leaned in closer to the mirror, looking at my own face. Was it just the fog of sleep clouding my vision, or was something else happening? Was I losing my mind? I thought about the pills, the Somnix 12. The label had said they could cause vivid dreams, but this was something else. It was like the lines between dreams and reality were being eroded, slowly and relentlessly. I went to the kitchen and grabbed a cup of water, trying to shake the unease creeping up my spine, but the more I thought about it, the more it didn't feel like just a dream anymore. It was as though something was leaking into my life, something that was never meant to be there. Over the next few days, I started noticing more of these small, wrong things. I found clumps of dark hair in the drain. I stared at them for a long time, wondering how it was possible. I'm blonde, there's no way my hair could turn black overnight. But it was there. I couldn't explain it, and I didn't want to. I could have ignored it. I could have brushed it off. But then I found the scratches. They weren't deep, but they were there. 3 parallel lines across the inside of my arm, just above the elbow. They looked like something had scratched me from the inside, like claws had scraped against my skin. Only there was no sign of a wound on the surface. I could still feel it, though. The phantom pain was sharp, as though whatever had done this was still under my skin. I remember sitting in my loft, staring at the marks, the air heavy with the scent of rain outside. I tried to convince myself that maybe I had scratched myself in my sleep. Maybe it was a reaction to stress, something my brain had made up to cope with everything. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. My therapist didn't help. I saw her once a week, and every time I tried to tell her what was happening, I felt the words slip away, as if they couldn't quite leave my mouth. I didn't want to. Sound crazy, even though I felt like I was losing grip on reality. "It's just stress, Lena," Dr. Thompson had said one day. She gave me a tight smile, the kind a professional gives when they're trying to be reassuring but don't quite know what else to say. "You're under a lot of pressure with work. Living alone in that old building, it's all adding up. You're probably just having an exaggerated response to stress." I nodded along, her words settling like dust in my chest, suffocating me. Maybe she was right. Maybe I was just losing my mind. But then there was the homeless man outside the bookstore. I'd seen him a few times before, always sitting on the same bench under the streetlight, muttering to himself. He wasn't a regular in Black Harbor, but he'd been there long enough for people to know him. I'd never paid him much attention until the day he stopped me on the way to work. "You're not safe," he said, his eyes wild, darting around, like he was afraid someone would hear him. "They're peeling back the veil." He crossed himself before hurrying off down the street, muttering under his breath. I stood there, the words echoing in my mind. Peeling back the veil? What did that even mean? I thought about it for days. And then the worst part came. The scratches weren't just a physical thing, they were starting to itch. Not on the surface, but underneath. Like something was crawling just beneath my skin, something I couldn't see. It was as if I could feel it moving, twisting its way through my veins. I'd run my fingers over the marks, and the sensation would stop. But the feeling never quite went away. It stayed, and the deeper I pressed, the more it seemed to respond. I wasn't sure if it was just paranoia anymore, or if something truly was under my skin. I tried everything. I washed my arms, I applied cream, I even tried to ice them down to numb the sensation, but nothing worked. The feeling was always there, lingering. One night I decided to confront it. I went into the bathroom, turned on the harsh light, and stood in front of the mirror again. The reflection was the same as before, but this time, I stared at it longer. My eyes were wide with fear as I searched for answers I couldn't find. That's when I saw it. In the corner of my vision, something shifted in the reflection. My reflection blinked again, but this time it didn't stop. It blinked again and again, its movements jerky and wrong. I wasn't the one blinking anymore. The nightmares were never as bad as when I woke up. Waking up felt like a whole new kind of terror, one that I couldn't shake off no matter how hard I tried. But last night something shifted. I don't remember falling asleep, but I woke up with the strangest sensation. Like I'd been pulled from somewhere I couldn't reach, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't get back there. The first thing I noticed was the smell. It wasn't the usual damp air from the old bookstore, or the lingering scent of mildew that clung to everything. No, this smelled like burnt sugar, sweet and acrid, like something that had been on fire and was now slowly dissolving. I had barely registered the smell when I felt the sharp gnawing ache at the back of my neck. That was when I realized something was off. The dream had followed me. I wasn't sure where I was anymore. I opened my eyes only to find myself in the cavern again. I was in the same place I'd been trapped in for what felt like weeks. The same endless black void stretching out around me. The walls of the cavern were soft, like flesh, like skin that breathed in and out with a slow, rhythmic pulse. There was no sky, no stars, just this twisted expanse of darkness. And then I heard it. The whisperers. They were always there. Always, watching me from the edges of the cavern, their skeletal frames twisted and impossibly thin. They shuffled around in the shadows, their mouths sealed shut by strings of matted hair. Their hands stretched out, long and gnarled, pointing to something. Far in the distance, just beyond my reach, I was frozen in place. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The stench of burning sugar became overwhelming as the whisperers drew closer, and I wanted to scream. But my voice had already been stolen by the dream. They circled me, dragging their fingers along the walls of flesh, leaving dark trails behind them, and that's when I saw him, the running man. His legs bent at the wrong angle, backwards, impossibly so. His knees jutted out at grotesque angles, and his arms swung unnaturally as he sprinted toward me, his gait jerky, the air buzzing with the sound of his rapid, uneven footsteps. His face was obscured by shadow, but I could see his fingers. Too many fingers, too long. He was coming for me. No, I thought. I won't let him. I can't. I tried to move, but my body was frozen, my muscles locked in place like stone. I screamed, though I knew my voice would never reach him. I wanted to run, but I couldn't. My feet wouldn't budge, my legs were made of lead. He reached me, his hands closing in around my shoulders. The sensation was unlike anything I had ever felt. His fingers sunk into my skin like sharp, burning needles, pressing deep into the muscle. His breath. Oh God, his breath. It smelled like the fire from my childhood home, the one that had burned everything to the ground, taking my parents with it. It was a smell that had haunted me since I was 8, the sound of sirens and the frantic yells of neighbors still echoing in my ears. "You're almost here," the running man whispered, his voice low and slithering, curling inside my mind. His voice was too familiar, too close. I could feel the heat of his breath as it brushed across my face. His forehead pressed against mine, and for a moment, I was frozen. The air was thick with a sense of something terrible, something old and rotten crawling under my skin. And then, just like that, he was gone. I blinked, and the cavern dissolved. I was back in my bed, drenched in sweat, heart pounding in my chest, but something was wrong. The room didn't feel right. The silence was too heavy, too thick. I pulled myself out of bed, disoriented and shaking. The cold floor beneath my feet did nothing to ground me. I stumbled to the bathroom, hoping the mirror would provide some kind of reassurance. Instead, I found a horror far worse than the dream. There on the bathroom wall was a message. It was smeared in what could only be described as blood or something far worse. The words were written in jagged strokes, each letter more desperate than the last. 2 more nights. I stumbled back, almost falling as I tried to process what I was seeing. My breath caught in my throat. 2 more nights? The reality of what I was dealing with hit me like a tidal wave. This wasn't just a dream anymore. This was something real, something that had crossed the boundary, something that was now in my waking world. The dream wasn't just following me, it was inside me. I could feel it, deep in my bones. I flushed the pills down the toilet that morning. I didn't care what it took. I knew that if I didn't get rid of them, if I didn't stop taking them, I would never be free. But it was too late. I kept hearing the whisperers, the voice of the running man, scratching at the back of my mind. Every time I looked into the mirror, I saw something wrong. My reflection blinked too late. It smiled too wide. It moved with a delay, like it was still trapped somewhere I couldn't reach. I wasn't sure if I was still in the dream, or if the dream was still in me. But as the days passed, one thing became clear. The more I tried to escape, the closer the hollow places behind my eyelids came to swallowing me whole. The nightmares weren't dreams at all. They were previews. They were pulling me closer to something far worse than I could have ever imagined. And now there were only 2 more nights left. The thing about fear is that it doesn't come all at once. It doesn't arrive like a thunderstorm, loud and furious. No, fear builds slowly. It taps at your shoulder and waits for you to notice. Just enough to make you feel uneasy, to start questioning yourself. But when you realize what it really is, it's already too late. I hadn't felt truly awake in days. When I woke up this morning, the air felt too thick, too heavy. The usual fog that hung in the corners of the loft was still there, but today it seemed more suffocating, more insistent. I rubbed my eyes and reached for my phone, but I couldn't focus on the numbers. I couldn't focus on anything, really. Hadn't taken the Somnix 12 for a week, not since I found the message on the bathroom wall. 2 more nights. I thought that would make it better. I thought stopping the pills would pull me back from the edge. I thought I could reset, that I could return to some semblance of normal. But that's the thing about nightmares. Once they've found their way into your head, they don't leave. Not for anyone. And the nightmares were different now. I wasn't trapped in the cavern anymore. No, now I was trapped in my own skin. Went to the bathroom, my feet dragging against the floor like they were made of lead. I turned on the light and glanced at my reflection. I didn't expect to see anything new, but there it was. Something wrong. My reflection blinked. But this time, the delay wasn't just an odd little quirk. It was a gaping, yawning chasm. I could feel the eyes of my reflection. No, not mine. It wasn't me anymore. I stared at myself for what felt like an eternity, unable to tear my eyes away. And then, just as I thought I might scream, the reflection grinned. I didn't smile. I wanted to run, to smash the mirror with my fists and escape whatever this thing was, but my hands were frozen at my sides. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I could only watch as the reflection's mouth stretched impossibly wide, its eyes narrowing with malice. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the grin faded. The reflection returned to its normal, lifeless state. I took a step back, my chest heaving, my breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps. That's when I saw the scratches again. The same 3 parallel lines, but this time they were on my neck, just under my jawline. They were dark, red and raw. I hadn't scratched them. I hadn't even noticed them until I saw them in the mirror. The skin around the lines was tender, like they'd just appeared. I couldn't even tell if they were real. Were they a product of the dream? Or were they something else, something worse? My stomach twisted and I doubled over, clutching at the bathroom sink for support. My reflection stared back at me, blank-eyed, unaffected by my panic. I forced myself to leave the bathroom, but the damage had already been done. I knew I couldn't trust myself. I couldn't trust my own body anymore. I couldn't trust the world around me. My mind was no longer mine. I wasn't just having dreams anymore. I had to leave. I had to get out of this apartment, out of this place, but where would I go? There was nowhere safe. I was a prisoner inside my own skin, trapped between the waking world and the horrors of my mind. I grabbed my coat and stumbled down the stairs to the bookstore below. The bell above the door rang out, an eerie metallic sound that sent a shiver down my spine. The place was always quiet, the air always heavy with dust and age, but today something felt even more oppressive. The bookstore was never really alive, but today it felt like it was suffocating me. Like the shelves were closing in, the air growing thicker with every breath I took. I walked through the aisles, my footsteps too loud in the silence. I reached for a book, not sure why. But as I pulled it from the shelf, I noticed something strange. A note fell out. A crumpled, yellowed piece of paper, barely holding together. I unfolded it with trembling hands. It was a drawing. The lines were jagged, uneven, almost like a child scribbles. But what struck me most was the figure in the center. A man, tall and thin with his legs bending backward. His face was obscured, but I could see the outline of too many fingers, too many joints. His arms hung down unnaturally, stretching as if they didn't belong. I dropped the paper, my heart racing in my chest. My legs gave out beneath me and I fell to the floor, gasping for air. The image was too real. It was him, the running man, the one from my dreams. No, I thought, my mind spinning in a frenzy. No, this can't be real. But deep down, I knew. It wasn't the dream anymore. It was me. I was the one trapped. The hollow places behind my eyelids weren't, just the remnants of nightmares. They were the spaces where the world didn't quite fit, the spaces where the things I couldn't see could hide. And they were crawling, inch by inch, closer to me. And soon, there wouldn't be a place left to hide. I hadn't left the apartment in days. Every inch of the room, every corner of the bookstore below felt like a prison that was slowly squeezing me into nothingness. I had always been a prisoner of my mind, but now it was as if my mind was beginning to become the very walls. I was trapped within. I couldn't even look out the window anymore. The world outside seemed too far away, like it didn't belong to me anymore. I'd flushed the pills down the toilet, thinking that would save me. I had tried to convince myself that it was the medication that was causing the horrors, that it was just some cruel trick of my brain. But it wasn't. It never was. I could feel the truth gnawing at me like a slow, painful infection. I had been right to stop the pills, but I had made a fatal mistake. The hollow places behind my eyelids, those spaces I once thought were just the remnants of nightmares, weren't fading. They were expanding. They were becoming more than just dreams. They were becoming memories, becoming truth. And that truth was clawing its way out of the darkness, one breath at a time. The worst part? The worst part was that I knew it now. I knew that I wasn't just losing my grip on reality. I was losing my place within it. The dreams were bleeding into the waking world, and the more I tried to escape them, the tighter they wrapped around me. I thought about leaving. I thought about packing my things and running, getting as far away from Black Harbor as I could. But deep down, I knew that wasn't possible. Because wherever I went, whatever corner of the world I tried to hide in, it would follow me. The hollow place would follow me. I couldn't outrun it. And I couldn't wake up. I didn't even notice when the first figure appeared in the corner of the loft. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light. My vision had been blurry lately, too much staring at mirrors, too much listening to the static in the background of my mind. But then I blinked, and the figure didn't move. It didn't dissolve into thin air like I had hoped. No, it stayed. A tall silhouette with its arms hanging unnaturally low, the same spindly figure that haunted my dreams. The figure of the running man, now standing before me in the flesh, or at least something that resembled it. My heart pounded in my chest and I froze, my legs refusing to move. I couldn't run, I couldn't scream, I couldn't do anything. The figure didn't speak. But I didn't need words, I could feel it. It was the same oppressive weight that had suffocated me in the cavernous space of my dreams. It was the same thing that had pressed its forehead to mine, its fingers digging into my skin. It wasn't just a dream anymore. It wasn't even something I could escape by waking up. It was real, and it was coming for me. I closed my eyes, trying to block it, Out. I tried to convince myself it was just another trick of the mind, another nightmare that was too real for comfort. But the scent of burnt sugar filled the air, thick and cloying. The smell I had grown to dread. The smell of the hollow. The whisper came next. "You're almost here." The voice didn't sound human. It was warped, a mangled echo of something I couldn't understand. And when I opened my eyes, the running man was gone, but I could still feel it. The hollow place was still there, lurking just behind my vision, just behind the walls. I stumbled backward, my mind racing for any explanation, any escape. But there was nothing. There was nowhere left to run. I knew what I had to do. I had to finish it. I had to end it once and for all. I grabbed the nearest object, a shard of broken glass from an old picture frame, and held it tightly in my hand. It was cold, and I could feel the sharp edges pressing into my skin. My reflection in the shard stared back at me, wide-eyed and frantic. But I couldn't see my own eyes anymore. I couldn't recognize the person I had become. I raised the shard to my wrist, trembling. And that's when I saw it, the hollow place. Not in the reflection, not in the shadow, but in the very air around me. It was there, breathing, pulsing. The walls began to warp, stretching and shifting, becoming that same cavern I had seen in my dreams. Flesh, raw, shifting flesh. And in the distance, the red light. I screamed. But it wasn't my voice anymore. It was someone else's. Someone trapped in the place between nightmares and reality. The thing under my skin twisted and pulled. My reflection, the thing that wore. My face stepped forward, grinning. Its mouth stretched wider, impossibly wide. And I knew then I was already gone. The hollow had taken me,